Siema, siema, Spliff TV, witam serdecznie. Mam dzisiaj dla Was nagranie z wykładu profesora Grofa z Krakowa, które zrobiłem kilka lat temu na swój prywatny użytek. Ale ostatnio bardzo wielu Was mnie pyta właśnie o to nagranie, w tym organizatorzy. Więc postanowiłem je upublicznić. Nagranie nie jest najwyższej jakości, ale ze względów naukowych, ze względów sentymentalnych udostępniam je Wam dziś.
Profesora Stanislava Grofa. Profesor Stanislav Grof wygłosi w dniu dzisiejszym i jutrzejszym cykl wykładów zatytułowanych Propozycja radykalnej rewizji w psychiatrii, psychologii i psychoterapii. Wnioski z półwiecza badań nad świadomością. Badania profesora Grofa rozpoczęte w latach 50. w wczesnej Czechosłowacji są głównym czynnikiem dokonującej się prawdopodobnie przemiany paradygmatycznej we współczesnej nauce i w cywilizacji globalnej. Profesor Grof jest za sprawą swoich badań nad odmiennymi stanami świadomości twórcą nowego kierunku psychologii, który nazywa się psychologią transpersonalną. Chciałbym bardzo serdecznie powitać profesora wśród nas i doktora pana, który jest jego asystentem i praktykiem techniki oddychania holotropowego.
Dziękuję, Kacperze. Przepraszam, może dużo błędów w mojej polszczyźnie, dlatego uczyłem wiele w domku. Szanowny Panie Profesorze, magnificencje dzisiejszego Uniwersytetu, dziękujemy za zaproszenie na wykład Scena, który jest, myślę, że pierwszym razem tutaj w Polsce. I dziękuję, że mogliśmy Holos i Gaja Mater zaprosić Stena, żeby przyjeżdżał do polskiego Krakowa i przedstawił swoje badania, które, jak mówił już Kacper, więcej jak 50 lat i rezultaty używa w leczeniu nabożeń psychicznych, psychiatrycznych, psychosomatycznych i ma też szkoli, wielkie szkoli Grof Transpersonal Training. Ja jestem jego uczniem, a jak skończyłem szkoły medycyńskiej, tak było to dla mnie wyzwa, co zrobić z tymi informacjami. Także jak chodził czas, tak spotykaliśmy się ze Stenem. Jesteśmy przyjacielami już więcej jak 20 lat i uczyłem u niego, co było możliwe. Teraz już więcej jak 15 lat przyjeżdżam do Polski, do Krakowa, do Katowic i do Warszawy czasami i prowadzę te oddychanie holotropowego warsztaty i czas od czasu spotykam się też z ludźmi, którzy nie pragną po sebepoznaniu, ale też im jest potrzebne leczenie. I w jaki sposób i te rezultaty dzisiaj przedstawia to. Dzięki uprzejmie Kacperze za zaproszenie, dzięki Stenowi, że ma czas i jak ma czas w Europie, także jest też w polskim Krakowie. Dziękujemy.
Dziękuję.
Okay, good evening everybody. Can you hear me? Before I start talking, I would like to thank for the very kind introduction to Dr. Sokolowski. I understand that he also is the main host. This is your idea to bring me here, and I appreciate it very, very much. I would also like to thank Dr. Milan Hrabánek, who organized this whole journey to Europe for me, and has been quite an amazing host for me. It's a great pleasure to be in Poland. This is not my first trip. Actually, my first visit was way back in Wrocław. There was an expo, an international exhibition, and then we also visited the Baltic area and traveled some in Poland before. So it's a real pleasure to be back and to have this opportunity to share with you something that comes out of more than half a century of study of non-ordinary states. The title of my lecture is very daring, obviously very provocative, but I'm not talking just for myself, or I will be primarily talking about my work. There is an entire community in the United States and today in the whole world that very much shares the transpersonal vision. So many of the things I will be talking about are not idiosyncratic for me. I will start in a somewhat unusual way. In that I would actually ask you a few questions, and you have them written there, so I will wait until you read the whole list. The basic idea is how many of you have had in your personal life some powerful, non-ordinary states of consciousness, any of those in this category? Okay, you can look around, you can look at the hands. This is probably somewhat self-selected audience, if you get attracted to this kind of title, but it is really something that we see all over the world. Great numbers of people have had these experiences, and there are about two reasons why I'm asking this question. One is that what I will be talking about comes from the study of non-ordinary states of consciousness, and it's generally much easier for people to relate to this material if they had some personal experiences in that category. The other one that I've worked therapeutically with non-ordinary states, first with psychedelic substances in Prague and then in the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center in the United States. And then my wife, and I have to unfortunately say late wife, Christina, she died on the 14th of June. We developed together something called holotropic breathwork, where you can induce very powerful non-ordinary states by faster breathing, by powerful evocative music, and a certain kind of body work. We just ended a large weekend workshop with over 100 people where we were using this particular method. And then Christina and I have worked over the years with many people who had spontaneous episodes of these non-ordinary states. So I have so far used the term non-ordinary states, but if you read American or English literature, you will find a different name, which is altered states. And those of us who have done some work in the area of consciousness research really dislike that term. In English it has a kind of a pejorative touch to it. It suggests that somehow in our everyday consciousness we have an accurate perception of ourselves and of the world, and then in these altered states it's somehow distorted. It's It's an inauthentic, incorrect way of experiencing ourselves and the world. And that is not the way the mystics experience it. When the mystics have these experiences, they have actually the feeling they're getting some additional information about the world to the one that we get in our everyday life, and that they understand better reality, they understand themselves better. So it's an additional source of information, not a distortion of who we are and what the world is about. When I heard the term altered states, I always have to think about veterinary medicine. In American slang and in the veterinary jargon, the term altered is used for castration of dogs and cats. Ask your friend, did you have your cat altered? Did you have your dog altered? So after all these years, I have a lot of respect for these states. I would like to call them altered, because I have a very different perspective. Now, I have actually been interested all these years in a very important subgroup of these non-ordinary states that have very specific characteristics. They have, in my experience, therapeutic potential. They have transformative potential. I believe that they have evolutionary potential and also heuristic potential. That means H-E-U-R. That means if we study these states, if we experience these states, we had some revolutionary, paradigm-breaking information about consciousness, the relationship between consciousness and matter, consciousness and the brain, revolutionary insights into the dimensions of the human psyche, about the roots of emotional and psychosomatic disorders. We also discovered some powerful therapeutic mechanisms not yet acknowledged by mainstream academic psychiatry. I was astounded when I started having experiences and observations in this area that Western psychiatry does not have a special category. We call all those states altered. We don't have a category, a mystical experience, a spiritual experience. All people who have episodes of these states would get a diagnosis, would be seen as mentally ill. And if you get the diagnosis, it's usually for life. It's enough to have one episode of these states and it never repeats itself, but you will be seen as a psychotic in remission. In other words, just the potential to have an experience like this, which is something that all of us can have under certain circumstances, not just with psychedelics, but a variety of other things, including some kind of spiritual practice, or holotropic breathwork, or some other form of powerful experiential therapy. So it's certainly not correct to see this particular category of states as being pathological. And Christina and myself, after working with psychedelic states and with holotropic states, we started referring to these states as spiritual emergencies. Psychospiritual crisis or transpersonal crisis. That means that if these states are properly understood, if they are supported, they actually can be healing, transformative, evolutionary. People can benefit from them. These states can be seen as a very radical effort of the organism to free itself from some traumatic past, traumatic experiences from childhood, from infancy, from birth, from prenatal life, and so on. So when I couldn't find a name, and I felt that they deserved a special name, I decided to coin a word myself, and I started calling them holotropic. Holos means whole. So this is we would say neologism. It's an artificially created word that comes from the Greek language, where holos means whole, and trepein means moving in the direction of something, or being attracted to something. You all know probably the term heliotropism. Helios is the sun, and trepein again moving towards. So holotropic means moving toward wholeness. But heliotropism, if you would say, would have a picnic by the field of sunflowers, and you stay there for 3 hours, you will see that they all would turn and follow and orient themselves towards the sun. So holotropic means moving toward wholeness. Usually when I mention that, there would be somebody who say, what do you mean moving toward wholeness? Aren't we whole already? The way we experience ourselves in everyday life? And I would say no, we experience in everyday life only a small fraction of what our experiential potential is. And I usually refer to Hinduism. In Hinduism, where we have the idea that we are not nama rupa, we are not name and shape, or in our own psychological language we would say we are not body egos. Our deepest identity is with a spark of creative cosmic energy that we carry in the innermost core of our being. And that Hindu term for it, Sanskrit term, is Atman. And for the Hindu, this is not an illusion or delusion. This is something that can be empirically validated if you are ready to follow certain fairly rigorous practices. Yoga, different forms of yoga. And you have the opportunity to actually have that experience, to finding that core within yourself and identify with it experientially. Now, if you have that experience of Atman, you recognize that that energy is identical with the cosmic creative energy, with the energy that created this universe, which in Sanskrit would be called Brahman. So we are not nama rupa, we are not name and shape, but in terms of our experiential potential, we are Atman Brahman. We have potential to experience ourselves in many, many ways that are different from the way we identify ourselves in our everyday life. So in the Upanishads, there is a question that's being raised. Who am I? Who are we? And the answer in Sanskrit is Tattvam Asi. Literally it means you are it. It doesn't sound very good, so in English you usually use archaic translation, which is thou art that, with capitalized T. You are not nama rupa, your deepest nature is divine. There's a different way that it was articulated by the French philosopher, paleontologist, Jesuit, Teilhard de Chardin, who said we are not human beings having spiritual experiences, we are spiritual beings having human experiences. And again, something like this can be experientially verified. It becomes a very convincing experience if we are in these non-ordinary states. I'm not a guru. I'm not saying this is the way it is. I'm a researcher. I'm saying I have seen many people having those experiences. It is within our experiential potential, and I have had those experiences myself. You probably know that today physicists would argue that the way we experience the material world might not be actually true and correct. They study matter and probe it down to the subatomic level. And, you know, the deeper you go, the less stuff, the less matter you are finding, until on the subatomic level you find mathematical equations, probabilities. You cannot say whether anything is there, you can express probabilities. And many people who were involved in developing quantum relativistic physics actually saw as a problem the fact that we experience the world as being full of solid objects when they couldn't confirm it scientifically. So many of them would open to the Hindu concept of Maya, that what we experience is really a virtual reality. I think I have Alan Watts here, British philosopher and writer who lived in the United States, who had yet another way of saying it. He says, we are not skin-encapsulated egos. You would then replace the concept of skin-encapsulated ego by some of these Eastern definitions that I was just mentioning. Okay. Now, this idea of the essential identity of the individual with the divine is actually really the deepest secret that lies at the core of all major religious systems. So I have quite a few quotes here from different religions. So I've already mentioned Hinduism. We are not Namarupa, we are Atman Brahman. We spent some time with Swami Muktananda, who was the head of the Siddha Yoga tradition, and used to say, God dwells in you as you. We have here reference to Buddhist scriptures, where you can repeatedly read, look inside, you are the Buddha, each of us is Buddha. And we can again, in some rigorous spiritual practices, have that experience. It's a very real experiential potential for us to see it that way, to experience it that way. In the Confucian tradition, you will find heaven, earth, and humans are the same. In the mystical interpretation of the teachings of Jesus Christ, you find Father, you and I are one. I have Saint Gregorius Palamas, who said, the kingdom of heaven, nay, which is like no, the king of heaven is within us. We have a Kabbalist here, Abulafia, who said, he and we are one. And even Muhammad said, whoever knows himself knows his Lord. And then the last example is a very extreme case, which was the Sufi Halaj, who had dared somehow to say that publicly and had to pay his life for it. He was killed and burned for that statement. This is something that's not very popular in organized religions, but you find it really in all mystical traditions, that you ultimately find the divine within and also in the world, in nature. Okay, now, where do you find holotropic experiences? What are the contexts in which you find them? Which are the different areas that I have been interested in. The first example would be what the anthropologists call the shamanic illness, with our Western bias. We prefer to call it shamanic initiatory crisis. The career of many shamans begins by a spontaneous visionary state that sometimes follows some weakening of a physical disease, but it's not necessary. In many instances, this happens absolutely spontaneously, that they spend days or weeks in this holotropic state, and there's a certain kind of an archetypal form that it takes in shamanism. It's usually an experience of a visionary journey into the underworld, in which the novice shaman would be exposed to attacks of various evil forces, evil spirits, and experience some very painful ordeals and procedures. They might have the experience that flesh is scraped from their bones, that blood is sucked out of their vessels, they lose the eyes, and they typically experience total dismemberment and annihilation. And this is then followed the experience of rebirth, when they are having a sense that they are getting new body, new flesh, new eyes, new blood. In some cultures they have the feeling that they got actually their body is now crystalline, this is crystal, rather than the heavy sort of material body as it was before, because they ultimately experience it as energetic body, they experience the energy of the body. And then this is followed by a journey into the supernal realm, kind of a magical flight, that again in different cultures would take different archetypal forms. So in some cultures it could be experiential identification with a solar bird, like a falcon, like an eagle, a thunderbird, a condor, or the experience of being carried by a solar bird into the supernal realm. And what is absolutely fascinating is that during this process, the shamans typically heal themselves. They heal themselves from a variety of emotional diseases, psychosomatic diseases, and there are quite a few instances where they heal themselves from physical diseases. And this is so common that the Western anthropologists refer to shamans as wounded healers, people who, before this episode of the shamanic crisis, they were sick in various ways, and they managed to heal themselves through that process. Not only that, they actually get like a crash course in healing. They learn how to heal others. And although many shamans, when they complete the journey and ground the journey, they might also know a lot about herbs and naturalistic healing, but the essence of the shamanic healing is energetic. And we just barely begin to understand that concept, but it's not absolutely essential in Far Eastern medicine, especially Chinese medicine, the idea, Japanese also, the idea of vital energies, ki or chi, and when these vital energies are flowing, that's the best condition for healing, and also it is the best way you can do for prevention. There are actually anecdotes about the Chinese doctors that they got paid from their patients as long as they stayed healthy, and when they got sick, the doctor had to support them. This would be a very healthy system. In the United States, the hospital get paid for the number of beds that are occupied by the patients. Much healthier to get paid for the number of beds that they manage to successfully empty. Now this is a great example of what Christina and I call spiritual emergency. You have somebody who, by Western standards, is going through an extremely disturbing emotional crisis that would definitely get the diagnosis of psychosis in our culture. But if it is allowed to run its course, if it's allowed to complete itself, it actually is favorable for the person. It is healing, it transforms the person in a positive way. It's important to say that to be a shaman is not enough to go into the Z-band out and stay there. You have to have the experience and then manage to bring it back and ground it. And you have to function at least as well as the rest of the tribe. It's usually a misconception among the anthropologists that these native cultures don't have good psychiatry, and so everybody who does something weird, something crazy, is considered to be sacred. Now, these cultures are not idiots. They know who is a shaman, who is just plain crazy or sick. So the idea is that it has to get grounded, and they become very, very effective as healers. They are very frequently artists. They know how to play instruments. They compose songs. They design rituals. They are typically very good politicians. You know, they know all the gossip in the tribe, and they have you know, very important role in these native cultures. There are also some other forms, other archetypal patterns for this transformation. In some cultures, it's not association with solar birds, but it's, for example, climbing a rainbow, or climbing the world tree, or climbing a bridge of bows and arrows, and so on. But the general pattern is journey into the underworld, being going through very difficult time, being annihilated, or experiencing oneself as annihilated, as dismembered, and then coming together in a new way, in a healthier body, and in the process learning how to heal others using energetic interventions. In other words, freeing blocked energies in the body. Okay, the other very important area where we find these holotropic states are rituals of native cultures that are called rites of passage. This is a term that was coined by a Dutch anthropologist Arnold van Gennep, G-E-N-N-E-B, who studied many of these cultures, and he found out that they all, practically without exception, had very powerful rituals that they would enact at the time of some important either biological or social transitions. For example, a birth of a child, circumcision, puberty is the time of very important rites of passage, marriage, menopause, and then of course dying, and some of the social occasions for rites of passage would be, for example, initiation into the warrior status, or it could be migration into another territory, be marked by a ritual of transition. Now, if you study what happens in these rites of passage, they would use some powerful, again, consciousness expanding means, and there is a large number of them. In some cultures it would be psychedelic plants, in others it would be a combination of fasting, sleep deprivation, stay in the Arctic, stay in the desert, vision quest in the mountains. In many cultures it involves very painful procedures as well. Bloodletting, for example, in the Lacandon Maya people. It could involve massive loss of blood in this case. It could be severe pain, like in the Lakota Sioux Sundance, where they get hooks to the pectoral muscles that they are elevated, and then these ropes are kind of rotated until the hooks are torn out of the pectoral muscles. In the Plains Indians, Mandan Indians, they have Okipa ceremony, where there's not only the situation with the hooks through the pectoral muscle, but they are hanging quite high, and they have also hooks through the buttocks, through the gluteal muscles, and they have heavy skulls of buffaloes hanging there. And they first rotate it until the hooks are released from the pectoral muscles, and then they have to run in a circle until they lose the buffalo skulls. So I'm mentioning this to show how important these rituals are for these cultures, how far they go, you see, to what extremes, and how they value that experience of psycho-spiritual death rebirth, which happens. The experiences are very similar to the transformation of the shamans, but the shamanic transformation is valued more in native tribes than the rite of passage, because the shamanic transformation is seen as a higher calling. The shaman is chosen for that, whereas these are human-made, these are kind of, artificially produced. But in both instances, they are seen as being very, very important part of human development. Now, in the puberty rites, which are, especially relevant for our present situation, when you have a group of people who reach adolescence, boys and girls, they would be separated from the rest of the tribe, isolated, and they would be put through some powerful procedures, through some of the means that I mentioned. And if you study what happens experientially, again, they experience death and rebirth. And in these cultures, this is then interpreted that they now died in their old role. They died as boys and girls, and they are now born as adults with all the rights and all the duties of adults. And nobody in the tribe will dare to treat them as children after they have been through a rite of passage. Different from the Western culture, where you can be 50 years old and come home, and for your parents, you're still your little girl or little boy, and your parents think that they can make decisions for you in your life, who you marry, whether you marry, and how you handle your life. So, people like Margaret Mead, very famous American anthropologist, Mircea Eliade, a Romanian scientist and anthropologist who lived in the United States, had the idea that the fact that we lost meaningful rites of passage is responsible for the enormous problems that we have with our adolescents. That, if we don't offer socially sanctioned rites of passage that would be conducive to this kind of transformation, that these young people feel very deep need for some ritual of this kind, and they create their own. They take drugs on their own, and they do various kinds of things that are very destructive. We were once invited to a conference by a New York State representative who was very, very disturbed by the behavior of the adolescents in New York City, the gangs which they formed, they were fighting with each other. We found that they had great need for ritual events. So for example, when a man wanted to be a member of the gang, they would give him a gun and send him to the street, and he had to kill somebody. Now in Africa, if you come of age, they give you a spear and you have to kill your first lion. In these gangs, it takes a somewhat different form. If it was a girl who wanted to be part of the gang, she had to have sex with all the members of the gang, and then she was in. And when somebody was killed in these ritual fights in the streets, they had very elaborate ritual funerals. So this New York State representative called this conference that we were invited to. And the question was very much like for Margaret Mead or Mircea Eliade, can we actually create rites of passage for these people? When this would be socially sanctioned, and would it help us with these problems that we have with young generation? We went to this conference, and before the conference with Margaret Mead, where the question was, do the rites of passage have to develop organically out of the history of the tribe, or can we fabricate one and create one? So we were discussing things, and I don't know if this would be known in Europe, at least by the names that I would be using, but it would be a combination of something like outward bound. I don't know if you see here the American program Survivor. When you take the person and leave them somewhere on an island and they have to support themselves. Or another one would be what's called ropes courses in the United States. That's now applied by many corporations for team building, where you create a very complex situation in the forest. You stretch ropes from one tree to another, and then, let's say, two people have to cross two ropes supporting each other, and they have a harness, which is then held by the rest of the people who are dependent on another person, also dependent on the group. Or you have a platform and then a hanging tire, and you have to jump and catch it. So these are things that are being done in the United States. Most of us in California have walked on fire, for example, something that was brought from Indonesia. And of course, psychedelics are unlikely to be used in this, but something like holotropic breathwork could be used, because all rites of passage had the element of holotropic states. So there are very serious efforts now to create something like rites of passage for young people to channel those destructive and self-destructive energies that create problems in society. Okay, the next very important situation where you find holotropic states were the ancient mysteries of death and rebirth. People like Joseph Campbell, who studied these cultures, they found that they all had very powerful myths that described different gods, demigods, legendary heroes who died in one way or another, or were killed, or they visited the underworld, the realm of the dead, and returned. So the many of these stories that you will know, the oldest one from Sumer is the story of Inanna and Dumuzi. Inanna lost her lover and she traveled into the underworld to find an elixir of immortality to bring him back to life. Orpheus going to retrieve Eurydice. Odysseus had a journey into the underworld. We have the stories of Isis and Osiris, Attis and Adonis. Dionysus was torn to pieces and revived. The story became the basis for Bacchanalian. In Mesoamerica, we have the mysteries of Xibalba in the Mayan culture, and similar rites which are related to Quetzalcoatl, represented as a plumed feathered serpent. So in all these different cultures, where they had these powerful myths, they also had mysteries in which the initiates again would be put into these holotropic states of consciousness by a variety of means, either chemical or non-chemical. For example, the most famous of these traditions were the Eleusinian mysteries, which were conducted in a place called Eleusis, about 16 miles from Athens, for a period of almost 2,000 years. Now, you have to offer something impressive to people to keep their attention going for 2,000 years. And even after 2,000 years, they didn't stop just because people lost interest, but it was very brutally suppressed by Emperor Constantine, with a Christian emperor, together with all the other pagan cults. It was forbidden. But we have a situation where every 5 years in ancient Greece, the number of people were undergoing holotropic states of consciousness. The question is, how was it induced? Albert Hofmann, the discoverer of LSD, Gordon Wasson, who brought the magic mushrooms of the Mazateks to Europe and gave it to Hofmann for the isolation of a substance called psilocybin, and a Greek scholar called Karl Rack. They wrote a book after extensive research, the book that's called The Road to Eleusis, or Eleusis, and found that the key to these mysteries was a sacred beverage, sacred potion, which was called Kykeon, K-Y-K-E-O-N, and they found out that it was a derivative of ergot, very similar to LSD. It was really a psychedelic color. So, the interesting question is, how many people had these experiences? Christina and I visited the ruins of Eleusis, that you can see, and the main hall where this was happening is called Telestrion. We had a guide, and it's enormous. So I asked, how many people had these experiences here every 5 years? And could you guess? 3,000 people, okay? So if you put into ancient Greece every 5 years, 3,000 people having powerful psychedelic experiences, it would have some influence on the culture. We saw what happened in the 60s, the American culture. And, this was a smaller world. So this is a best kept secret really about the Greek culture. We all see Greece as the cradle of civilization. The Greeks were very intelligent people. They had all kinds of interesting ideas. It puts it into a different perspective. If every 5 years, 3,000 people in that world had psychedelic experiences. So when I imagine Plato today, I don't see him pacing in the academy and saying, well, let me see how the world works. So we don't have just this level, there's this other level, the forms, the ideas, the archetypes. This was obviously something that he experienced. He was himself an initiate of these mysteries. Actually, the list of the people in ancient Greece who had these experiences reads like, we have books in the United States that say, who is who in America? Who are the important people in America? So this list of the initiates in Greece and in Asia Minor reads like who is who in antiquity. It includes Plato, Aristotle, the military leader, Alcibiades, it includes Pindarus, it includes Marcus Aurelius, Cicero wrote about these experiences. Those were all initiates, they all had experiences of this kind. So this is something that remains to be seriously studied in Greco-Roman history, something that really was not seriously taken into consideration. And then we can also take a large category of methods that I call technologies of the sacred. Those are methods for inducing holotropic experiences that emerged in the context of the great religions of the world. So we have any number of schools of Buddhism, for example, from Theravada, Vipassana, to Zen, to Vajrayana, Tibetan Buddhism. We have many different types of yoga. We have Taoist meditation exercises. We have Kabbalistic methods, Kabbalistic exercises. Hasidic dances were used for this purpose. In Sufism, we have different ways of inducing these states. For zikr, the whirling dervishes, or dervishes who don't whirl, but they use vocal performances. So those are very powerful methods that were developed in the great religions. In Christianity, hesychasm, Jesus' prayer, or the methods that the Desert Fathers were using to induce these experiences. And of course, the inspiration for all major religions came out of these holotropic experiences. Take the beginning of Buddhism, Buddha, powerful ascetic practices for 6 years, and then changing the strategy and meditating under the bo tree, and having this powerful visionary experience of the visitation of the master of the world illusion, Kamamara, who first brought his very voluptuous daughters, trying to get him interested in sex rather than spirituality. And then when that didn't work, and bringing army, hurricanes, and so on. And then Buddha managed to sit through these experiences and experience enlightenment. Then later had a whole series of past life experiences with the famous stories of, from his previous lifetimes, and then the element of freeing himself karmically, tearing of the karmic bonds. At the beginning of Islam, we have Muhammad's experiences. There's an amazing story which is called Miraj Name, the miraculous journey of Muhammad. There's a visitation of Archangel Gabriel, who takes him this amazing journeys through the seven realms of heaven, Islam, where he ends up having audience with Allah, experiencing what was described as ecstasy approaching annihilation, where he received the basic ideas for Quran, and then it was followed by the experience of visiting Gehenna, visiting hell. We have in Christianity Jesus in the desert, having the experience of the devil, the temptation. We have the experience of Saint John in his cave on the island Patmos, who had the vision of the apocalypse. We have the visionary experience of Saint Paul, the blinding vision of Jesus on the way to Damascus. So the sacred scriptures are really full of these holotropic experiences, and we would not have religions without there being at the beginning this revelation. This is not something that, religion is not something that came out of events in everyday life. It came out of these powerful visionary experiences. Unfortunately, many religions, when they become organized, they tend to lose the connection to the spiritual source, and they get involved in all kinds of other concerns, which are very secular. It becomes politics and possessions and control of people and so on. Things that have very little to do with spirituality. And in many instances, experiential spirituality, seeking these transpersonal experiences, remains alive in the mystical branches of the religion. Christian mystics in Christianity, or people who are parts of the monastic orders, where they actually go through prayers and fasting and meditation, or in Islam, Sufis who actually practice various types of spiritual procedures. In Judaism, we have the Hasidic Jews, or we have the Kabbalists. Those are all people who continue seeking spiritual experiences. In many of the organized religions, we go and we hear about experiences that people had 2,000 years ago, but you know, having a full-blown spiritual experience would not be a very popular event in today's churches. I don't know how many of you saw the movie about Francis of Assisi, which was the Brother Sun, Sister Moon. Anybody? It describes Saint Francis coming back from a battle, weak and sick, and it's very, very powerful experience, and it's actually an experience in church. And he takes off his clothes and walks around naked and goes into the business of his father, the rug salesman, and he's throwing the rugs out of the window. We don't need these riches, we don't give it to people. And there's an amazing scene in that movie where he creates the Franciscan order, and then he goes to Rome to ask the Pope if it was acceptable for the order to exist. And there is this amazing scene where you see the beauty of Vatican, the gold, the jewels, and so on, the robes, and the Pope walks to him and looks into his eyes, and then actually knees and kisses his feet and says, I once had what you have, don't anybody take it away from you. That's, you know, the emphasis on direct spiritual experience that should somehow continue to feed the religion rather than having it at the beginning and then just sort of referring to it. So this tradition of the direct spiritual experiences continues mostly in monastic orders and in the mystical branches of this great religion, when it is about the personal experience. Now, people who have, let's say, personal experience of God, or they have a personal experience of past lives, they don't call it belief. There's a very interesting movie about Carl Gustav Jung, which, when he was interviewed when he was over 80 years old, and this interviewer asks him at one point, Dr. Jung, do you believe in God? And Jung was thinking for a while, and he says, no. And the Jungians who are watching said, what? You know, Jung doesn't believe in God. And there was this very dramatic pause, and then he says, I know. See, I had the experience of being grabbed by something that was by far more powerful. Basically saying, if you have to call it belief, you know, then you're probably saying something that you got from your parents, or with an eloquent priest, or you read a book that was convincing. If you have the experience, then there is an experiential knowledge of that whole luminous dimension of our psyche, of fabric of reality. So what happens in these holotropic states is the direct experience of normally invisible dimensions of reality that have the quality of luminosity. This is something that Jung used. He took it from Rudolf Otto, and he preferred that to calling these experiences mystical or sacred or religious, because these other terms have been used in many different contexts and can be misleading. So we prefer this very neutral term, which is numinous. When we have an experience, holotropic type of experience, when it reaches a certain level in our psyche, the experiences start having a very special quality, luminosity. It's a whole different dimension that enters our experience. It could be compared to something like we have been watching up to that point black and white television, and now colors come. Quality, experiences get a very different quality, a direct experience of the sacredness of that dimension. Okay, can you wait, or is it urgent? You have to. Yeah, please. But you will need a microphone so that we can hear you.
I have a question which is like, I think, connected to my inner experience. And is like you said, you call the states not ordinary states of mind. And if in my experience I have this not ordinary states of mind so many times that they became for me ordinary, I cannot call them anymore not ordinary. Because I have them so many times.
Great comment, yeah. I should have actually mentioned that when I talked about altered states, you know, the term not altered states, that even that term non-ordinary is really not appropriate, because there are many non-ordinary states that don't have the healing quality or the transformative quality or the evolutionary quality. Our daughter is married to a man who is son of, the mother is a member of the Native American nation called the Ojibwe, Native, you know, what's called in Europe Indian. And we have been having these wonderful, wonderful discussions, and she actually told me, Stan, I don't know why you call these states non-ordinary. For my people, it's just part of a spectrum of experiences that human beings can have. What's non-ordinary about it? So, you know, here I think it's a pretty avant-garde idea in the academic circles, but for her it was still very limiting to call them non-ordinary. They're just part of human experience, something that under certain circumstances anybody can have. Okay, so thank you for reminding me. Okay, so I just say a few words about my own entry into this whole realm of holotropic states. It was, when I was a beginning psychiatrist, I volunteered for a psychedelic session, for an LSD session. And the clinic where I was working got a big box from Sandoz pharmaceutical company in Switzerland. And it came with a letter that accompanied. It was full of ampules, you know, that labels, very mysterious inscription in capital letters, LSD-25. And then the letter said that this was a very interesting new experimental substance that was discovered practically by accident by Albert Hofmann. Albert Hofmann didn't like that idea of accident, he called it serendipity. But anyway, the story was, he was an expert in ergot alkaloids. Ergot is a rye fungus, and it has alkaloids that have very important uses in medicine. Mostly, before LSD was developed, they had three major uses. One was stopping gynecological bleeding by contracting the uterus. The second one was the relief of migraine headache, and the third one was keeping the arteries open in geriatric populations. So this was kind of a apple that fell a little far from the tree, and suddenly it turned out to be, you know, one of the preparations turned out to be powerful, psychedelic. So Albert Hofmann synthesized LSD for the first time in 1938, and the number 25th, that this was the 25th derivative of lysergic acid. Lysergic acid is the main alkaloid in ergot. and he was adding different side groups to find, you know, more effective substances with less side effects. He synthesized it, he sent it to the pharmacologist for testing, and it came back not particularly interesting substance. Further research discontinued. And those of us who knew Albert, and you will see some pictures later, heard the story frequently that after he synthesized LSD and it was rejected by the pharmacologist, that he continued creating more derivatives, but that he couldn't get this one somehow off his mind, that he had this very urgent feeling that they must have overlooked something with this particular substance. And in 5 years, this became so strong that he actually decided to synthesize another sample, send it back for, he said, more careful examination. And of course, you know, no matter how careful it would be, as long as you work with rabbits and rats and so on, you would not discover that it has psychedelic effects. But what happened that during this synthesis, he started feeling strange, powerful emotions came, he started seeing colors, everything was moving, and he was in this non-ordinary state for 2.5 hours. And he thought he was going crazy, but then when he came down and was thinking about it, he said, maybe some other explanation, maybe I somehow intoxicated myself by this substance that I was working with. And really, until his death, he didn't understand how it could have happened. With this very proper, careful Swiss professor, you know, working with gloves. You don't lick your fingers when you make your drugs. But he said at one point, one of his eyes was itching, and he just very gently touched his eye. And this is such a powerful substance that it might have been enough to, you know, for it to be absorbed by the conjunctival sac and create this non-ordinary state of consciousness of more than 2 hours. And so a few days later he decided he would put it to a test. He prepared his work for the day, had a little notebook on the side, and he took what he, as he said, being a very conservative person, considered to be an infinitesimal dose, a minuscule dose, which was 25% of what the doses for other ergot alkaloids, which happened to be 250 micrograms. I don't know how many of you relate to that number, but this is a dose that, when we were using it therapeutically, would be considered a big dose. We would prepare people, you know, several hours, 8 to 10 hours preparation. There was usually a male and a female sitter with the person, keeping the person overnight, and then checking in the morning if they were okay. He took it very casually, and he thought every half an hour he would close his eyes and see if anything was happening. And of course, it's less than an hour, you know, this effect came now with vengeance, really, really powerful. He couldn't work, so he asked his assistants to take him home. And this was wartime, and there were some restrictions on the use of cars, so people were bicycling a lot. So he was commuting on a bicycle, and there is this marvelous description of Albert's ride through the streets of Basel under the influence of 250 micrograms of LSD. One point it seemed like time stopped and he was not really getting anywhere, but finally made it home. And he felt terrible, he felt he was dying, he felt his neighbor was a witch and was hexing him. And so he asked the assistant to go get the doctor. But when the doctor came, he was not dying anymore. Now he had relived his own birth, and he was now a very sweet newborn, feeling wonderful, feeling like solved one of his problems. And this was the beginning of the rest of his life. And to make a long story short, he wrote a report to his boss, Dr. Stoll. It just happened that the boss's son was a psychiatrist in Zurich, And they asked him if he would like to conduct a pilot study, which he did with a group of quote-unquote normal people and a group of psychiatric patients. And this overnight became a sensation in the world. Now, very few people know that this was not the psychedelic effect that was a sensation, because mescaline from the peyote cactus was already known in a pure form. Not only that we knew that there were plants that had psychedelic effect, but mescaline was already isolated, was already in pure form. The sensation here was the incredible power. It's about 1,000 times more powerful than mescaline. And so, what the excitement was about, that the human body could possibly, under certain circumstances, produce a substance like that and cause the mental changes, so that what we call mental diseases would not really be mental diseases, they would be aberrations of the body chemistry. And if we could find the culprit, you see, we could find another drug that would neutralize it, and we would have a test tube cure for schizophrenia. This would be like holy grail, you know. And so now Sandoz was sending it to different research institutes, to universities and even individual therapists with this letter saying, we feel that this could be somehow some substance interesting for psychiatrists, psychologists, the medical students and so on. And it gave 2 tips. The first one was, you could produce something like experimental psychosis, because there seemed to be some similarity between the experiences induced by those substances and what some of the psychiatric patients are experiencing. And then there was a second, it's always great to have a model. You take people, you do various examinations before, during and after, and you get insight as to what's happening biologically when the mental, emotional functioning of people is so profoundly influenced. And there was another tip which became my karma, or my destiny, whatever you want to call it. It said that this could also possibly be used as a kind of unconventional educational tool for psychiatrists, for psychologists. They could take the substance and spend a few hours in the world that seemed to be similar to the world of some of their patients. And as a result of this experience, they would be able to understand their patients better, they'd be able to communicate with them more effectively, and hopefully be more effective in treating them, which was kind of sorely needed. I mean, psychiatry was really medieval. We were using insulin comas, electroshock, cardiac shocks, you know, dunking people in cold water, putting in straitjackets and so on. So this was very exciting, that maybe we are on the way to some really radical discovery. So I volunteered, of course. I was at the time very disappointed with psychoanalysis, which was my original reason to go and study medicine and psychiatry. And so I became one of the early volunteers, and my preceptor, Dr. Robicek, was very interested in electroencephalography, and particularly the effect of a stroboscopic light on electroencephalography. So those of us who wanted to have the experience with LSD had to agree to have the EEG done before, during and after, and also to be exposed to this gigantic stroboscope. So in the middle of my session, when these experiences were culminating, the research assistant came and said it was time for the experiment. This was called driving the brainwaves, or entraining the brainwaves. Time to drive the brainwaves. So she took me into this little room. I lied down. She pasted the electrodes on my head, and then brought this gigantic strobe and turned this thing on. And in the next moment, there was light like I had never seen, couldn't even imagine existed. Like when the mystics say it was like millions of suns. At the time, I thought it was like something like what happened in Hiroshima, you know, when the bomb went off. Today, I think it was more like the Dharmakaya, the primary clear light that we see according to Barbara Töder, according to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, we see at the moment of our death. And my consciousness was catapulted out of my body. I lost the research assistant, I lost the clinic, I lost Prague, I lost the planet. And I had the feeling that I ceased to exist, I mean, in the form in which I knew myself. But I somehow became all that was. I was nothing but everything at the same time. And these are things that are very difficult to describe usually. When you hear about mystical experiences, people would tell you it was ineffable. There were no words for it. So it was experience of being annihilated, becoming nothing, but also somehow becoming all of existence at once. And then on the way down, I had the experience of the astronomical universe, where processes were happening for which I didn't even have names at the time. But later I read about the Big Bang and the black holes and the white holes and the wormhole. It was something in that category. It was amazing, amazing sort of a display. And then she finished this experiment with the strobe, where she was playing with the frequencies in my brain. And my universe started shrinking again. I found Prague, I found the clinic, I found my body. But there was a problem, because my consciousness was now floating around my body, and I couldn't figure out how to put those two together. And it became just absolutely clear to me that what they taught me at the university was nonsense. That consciousness was something that somehow was created by the activity of the neurons in the brain. Consciousness was something cosmic. It was something that was much, much bigger, you know, a product of physiological processes in the brain. And then finally I managed to get those two together and find my body, align those two, and I was very impressed. And I thought, you know, I'm a psychiatrist. When you're a psychiatrist, this is by far the most interesting thing you can study. These non-ordinary states, these holotropic states. So this is now over 50 years when that happened, and during that time I've really done very little professionally that would not have some kind of relation to these holotropic states. It became my passion, my vocation, my profession, my obsession, if you want. And it became like a goal of my life to understand more about these states. Okay, so the areas of interest, I was involved in clinical research with LSD, first in the Psychiatric Research Institute in Prague, and then I emigrated to the United States and joined a team at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, which happened to be the last official research in the United States, and for several years I actually was in charge of this research project until it became more and more difficult for administrative reasons, for what was happening in the young generation with psychedelics. And then finally the research kind of tapered off. And I moved to a place called Esselen, which is an amazing place on the west coast, old Indian grounds that also, there's also hot springs, which were the sacred hot springs of the Indians. And now there is kind of like a human laboratory where since 1962 people who had something new to offer that was too much for universities and research institutes and so on could go and offer workshops and sort of work with people. And so we then lived in Esselen, and then Christina and I developed what we call holotropic breathwork, where you can induce quite powerful experiences of the same kind by faster breathing, by evocative music, a lot of it coming actually from the native traditions they used for inducing trance, and then a certain kind of bodywork that's involved. I had some other experiences in Maryland. Still, we had John Lilly, known for the research of dolphins, built a full-size sensory deprivation tank, so we could have experiments with that when you are in darkness, no sounds, temperature of the water is like the temperature of your body, and you can stay there for hours. And again, this state where there is no sensory input can create powerful experiences. So this was the work with psychedelics, the work with the holotropic breathwork, the work with the sensory deprivation tank, and then Christina and I, over the years, worked with many people who had these spontaneous episodes of non-ordinary states that we call spiritual emergencies. Yeah, then I have some areas of related interest. The common denominator always was that they were holotropic states there. So working with shamans, exchanging information with anthropologists. I participated in many native ceremonies with peyote, with mushrooms, the Maladic magic mushrooms, with kava, with ayahuasca and so on. Then also friendship with parapsychologists and with personal knowledge of psychics. We had a large study of more than 200 people who were had terminal cancer, and we were doing psychedelic sessions with them. And the idea there was, if mystical experiences induced by psychedelics can take away the fear of death and can transform the process of dying itself. The most interesting and moving projects that we had. I described it in the book that's called The Ultimate Journey, what we learned about death, both biological death and also this psychospiritual death that I described for shamans and rites of passage and these mysteries and so on. I had great interest in this development of the new discipline called thanatology, study of both the processes, psychological processes as people are approaching death when they're dying, but also the study of near-death experiences where people are suddenly put into a situation where their life is threatened. And it's one of the areas that many of the paradigm-breaking observations are coming. It's probably known, that people can be in a state of clinical death, and as they are being resuscitated, their consciousness moves out of the body, and they watch the whole procedure from the ceiling, and then consciously decide to go for a little trip and go through the walls and experiences what's happening in other rooms of the building, or go through the ceiling and look around and see what's happening around the hospital, experience something that's happening 200 miles away. And there are now studies showing that people who are organically blind since the time they were born, when their consciousness gets out of the body, they can see. And not only can they see, but what they see can be consensually validated by people who have the gift of vision. The most important book about this was Ken Rain's book, which was called Mind Sight, the capacity of disembodied consciousness to actually maintain the capacity to perceive the environment. So that was one of my great interests, studying these kinds of phenomena around death and dying. About 1/3 of that book, The Ultimate Journey, is the description of the study that we did with terminal cancer patients as a preparation for death. Another area, fascinating area, is the experiences of people who had visions of UFOs or extraterrestrial encounters, abduction experiences. A researcher, John Mack, of the psychoanalyst at Harvard University, and also did our own training with somebody who worked with holotropic breathwork, studied over 200 of these cases at Harvard. Finally became, those were what he called anomalous phenomena. It's not easy to discount it, that these people are all crazy, you know, paradigm. And then I was also interested in visiting ashrams, and, you know, places where people were doing some intense spiritual practice and exchanging information with yogis, with Tibetan Buddhists, with Zen Buddhists, with Christian mystics, particularly people like Brother David Standaras. I don't know if he's known here. Father B. Griffith in India. And deep, long friendship with Jack Cornfield, who is a wonderful Vipassana teacher. We have done, with Christina and Jack, we have done over 30 week-long seminars where we combine Vipassana Buddhist meditation with the breath work. So those were all my interests that were sort of outside of direct work with holotropic states, was learning from other people who, in one way or another, work with these states. Okay, so now the title is the proposal for a radical change in psychiatry, psychology, and psychotherapy. It comes from the observations and experiences that I've just described. And I'd like to put it in a larger framework by saying something about a very important book written by Thomas Kuhn, one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century, who studied the history of science for about 15 years and then wrote this book, which is called Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And his main point was that people make a mistake. They usually see the history of science as a gradual accumulation of more and more observation and formulations of more and more accurate hypotheses until we end up where we are now, which is the most profound knowledge about the universe and the human psyche that has ever been around. And he found out that this is simply not true, that the history of science breaks into very distinct periods, and they have a kind of cyclical nature, and the nature of these changes can actually be predicted. And the key to his theory is the concept of what he called paradigm, which is a set of certain metaphysical assumptions and beliefs and instructions for how to conduct research and how to evaluate research and so on, that dominates the scientific community for a certain period of time and is not questioned, is simply accepted by the whole scientific community. And he says, at the time when the scientific community is dominated by a paradigm, the scientists do what he called normal science, which is problem solving within a set of giving parameters. It's more like when you're playing chess, you see, you have this board with 64 squares, some of them black, some of them white. You have a certain number of figures with specific types of movement, and then you solve problems within that set of parameters. You cannot take the castle and use it as a bishop or as a queen. You have to play it by rules. So people who live in a period when there is a general belief in a certain paradigm, you have to stay within those limits, within those restrictions. But then what happens again, according to Thomas Kuhn, is that sooner or later observations come that start challenging the paradigm. Something doesn't fit, something the paradigm cannot explain, and initially it is dismissed. This couldn't happen, this is bad science, the guy didn't know what he was doing or she was doing. Sometimes it's even seen as a fraud and so on. Because there is another very important element that you find in scientific community that people like Korzybski and Gregory Basin called confusion of map and territory. That the generation not only has a certain way of seeing the universe, but they believe that they have an accurate and final description of how things are, and there would not be any major surprises. We already know what is possible, what isn't possible. So an example is Lord Kelvin, very famous physicist, who at the turn of the centuries, from the 19th to the 20th, gave a talk in the British Scientific Society, where he said, physics is a finished discipline. No major surprises, just more accurate measurements. Now this was 5 years before Einstein's 3 papers, this became a revolution. It's totally transformed physics, from Newtonian physics, first of theories of relativity, and then quantum physics, that even Einstein himself was not capable of accepting until his death, although his own work initiated that revolution. So what happens now, that if those are legitimate observations, they would keep coming, and then sooner or later it becomes clear to everybody that there is a crisis. Now, we really have too many anomalous phenomena. A good definition of anomalous phenomena is it is what is left when you apply a bad hypothesis. So if you have too many phenomena, anomalous phenomena, this is the time to change the paradigm. And sooner or later the academic community accepts it and understands it, and then suddenly the rules are loosened, and so wilder and wilder suggestions for paradigm change are being seriously considered, until out of this comes one paradigm that's victorious, and that governs then the scientific work for the next period. So 3 major paradigm shifts that I would mention here. One was the shift from the geocentric system to the heliocentric system. Ptolemy to Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo. Now this, I don't know if you are aware of the fact, this took 100 years from the Nuncius Siderius that was published, the first idea, to the time when it was really accepted by the scientific community. It was not just the church that stood somehow in the way. A lot of the resistance came from academic circle. All kinds of arguments why it isn't possible that the sun is the center of the system. The second one was the shift from so-called phlogiston chemistry to the atomic theory of Lavoisier and Dalton. So it's Becker had the idea that all substances are combinations of this royal substance called phlogiston and some other stuff. And when Dalton and Lavoisier came with the idea that maybe there are atoms, and that would be a better way of thinking in terms of atoms, there was tremendous resistance. It took time before phlogiston theory was abandoned. Today we laugh, we hear about phlogiston, but this was a serious issue that was discussed in the academic circles. So, Okay, so I myself believe, and a number of my colleagues in the transpersonal psychology believe, that we are now in a situation of abnormal science. There are just simply too many observations that the current paradigms cannot explain. And the one I mentioned about near-death experiences is one of them. You don't have to study medicine to know that if you are in a coma, lying with your eyes closed, you shouldn't be seeing anything, let alone, unless there are some visions, let alone watch the whole situation from the ceiling, or experience accurately something that's happening in another room of the building, or experience something that's happening 200 miles away. There's any number of transpersonal experiences where we experience things that we have no way of knowing. It's not something that's coming through the senses. The consciousness itself somehow is receiving the information. I will talk about it more later. So when I was studying these holotropic states of these various categories and also exploring these areas around, I was writing books about these challenges, about these paradigm challenges that we were encountering in this work, and writing books about it, and several of them were published by State University New York Press. And when I was approaching my 70th birthday, I got a telephone call from my editor at SUNY Press, State University New York Press. And she said, Stan, we published several of your books about different aspects of your work. Would you consider writing one book that would kind of bring it all together? And it could be like an introduction for the books that were already published. And then there was a pause, and then she said, and would you consider to focus specifically on observations that current psychology and psychiatry cannot explain? Okay, and there was an even longer break, and then she said, and would you consider just to sketch, what psychology, psychiatry would look like when, so that it's capable of integrating all these new challenging informations. So this is what we call in English a tall order. I don't know how easy it is to translate into Polish. It's a big sort of order, big expectations. But I was in a situation where I was considering to at least semi-retire. Hasn't really quite happened until today, and do a little more reading and a little more writing. And by the time we had that training that Milan mentioned at the beginning, people who become practitioners of holotropic breathwork, people learn how to run these sessions and do a lot of their own work. And there was a whole new generation of people who were now doing this work all over the world. Training in Australia, Mexico, and Chile, and Argentina, Australia, several countries in Europe. And we needed a handbook so that people, there's some kind of consistency in what people teach. And this was like an offer to make the handbook for our training. So I accepted and I wrote the book. And then I decided to give it a very provocative title, quite deliberately, calling it Psychology of the Future. And the reason behind it was, before I wrote books like The Stormy Search for the Self, or Beyond the Brain, or The Adventure of Self-Discovery. Those are kind of very tame titles, but if you see, this is psychology of the future, people will pay attention. Either they get interested or they get pissed, they get irritated. How do you dare? And there would be a better chance that people would really pay attention to it. So the book is called Psychology of the Future. Do we need a break? I forget about breaks before we go into this. How are we doing in general time?
Zróbmy teraz 5-minutową przerwę.
And the information can be found on a website called holotropic.com. If you are interested, it describes the training and what the program is like. Maybe tomorrow when we have more time I can talk a little about it. Tonight we have to cover some material, so I don't want to take time for that. But if you are interested in becoming facilitators or participate in the program, you can take the program without wanting to be facilitator, just for your own growth and for your own healing. So you find the information on holotropic.com. Okay, I mentioned the different areas in which I believe radical changes have to be made in psychology and psychiatry, and we'll very briefly go through that. The detailed description is in the book Psychology of the Future that I already mentioned. So the first point here is probably the most surprising, and that is that very few people realize that we have absolutely no proof that consciousness is generated from the brain. This is something that's based on the metaphysical belief that this is a material universe, that matter is primary, and that consciousness somehow has to be a derivative. Now what we have an enormous number of observations showing systematic correlation between what's happening in the brain, anatomically, physiologically, and states of consciousness. But none of those correlations is really a proof that consciousness is coming out of the brain. Just to let you know what I mean is, I would point out something like television. In television we have the same kind of a situation, that the quality of the program, the sound, the pictures, critically depends on the functioning of the components in the TV set. But that is not a proof that the program is generated in the box. It still leaves the possibility that the set is really important, that very significant function, but that it mediates the program, it doesn't generate it. You would actually laugh if somebody would sort of study the transistors and the relays and down to the molecular level and believe that he or she would understand why at 7 o'clock you get a Mickey Mouse cartoon. Obviously there is a possibility of a whole other interpretation of the correlation. So the existence of the correlations is from the perspective of formal logic, something that's called non sequitur. It doesn't really follow from the fact that there are correlations that the consciousness is actually coming from the brain. And we have any number of observations showing that consciousness can do things that the brain cannot possibly do. And I will not go into the details, I'll just return again to those near-death experiences. You see that if you can experience something that's happening behind the wall in another part of the building, your consciousness can go through the roof and look around and see what's around this building. That's not something that the brain can do, at least the way we understand the brain. And I mentioned the observations in blind people who can see when their consciousness leaves the body. This is something that we find in the Bardo Töre, in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, that when we die, we become a Bardo body, and the Bardo body has the capacity to travel anywhere in the world and perceive what is happening there. Of course, that doesn't make any sense to materialistic science, but it is something that can be confirmed in the work with these holotropic states. So, what we do, we focus on what we can study, which is, you know, the human body, the biological processes. But when it comes to the problem, how does matter create consciousness, nobody has ever tried to explain how that is possible. I remember many years ago, probably 20 years ago, I went to a bookstore and there was a book by Francis Crick with a Nobel Prize for cracking the molecule of DNA. And there was a book called The Astonishing Hypothesis. How many of you read the book? Can I see the hand? Some people did. The Astonishing Hypothesis. And there was a very promising subtitle, Nobel Prize winning scientist explains consciousness. So I said, wow, this is a book that I have to read. So I went, I bought the book, and then at the beginning is a statement of the astonishing hypothesis. And it's something like this. You, your hopes, your sadness, your worries, your expectations, it's nothing else but the activity of the neurons in your brain. And then it says, you are nothing but a pack of neurons. So that's not an astonishing hypothesis, that's the basic assumption of materialistic science. But then if you open the book, he says, let's narrow it a little and talk about the process of perception. When I'm watching Milan over there, there is a material object, light is reflected from him, it hits my retina, it creates electric changes, it creates biochemical changes that triggers a neuronal impulse that goes to the optical tract, more chemistry, more electricity, and we end up with potentials in the suboccipital cortex, which is the optical cortex. Again, electric potentials and biochemical changes. And then Crick gives like 40 pages of experiments showing that this is really happening in my brain when I observe Milan. And then he leaves it there when it's really where the problem begins. You see, what is it that can create out of chemical changes and electric changes in the suboccipital cortex a conscious experience in colors, in living colors of something that is a reasonable facsimile of what is out there and sort of projected into the space out there. So we study, where we can get results. It means we can study things in the retina, we can study the electric currents in the optical tract, we can study what's happening in the suboccipital cortex. But when you start coming to the problem of how does now matter create consciousness, nobody has ever even tried to think about it because there's simply no answer. We don't know where we start. To guess how could matter possibly create consciousness. This is a metaphysical assumption. This is not a scientific statement. Gregory Bateson used to say, psychology and psychiatry bet on the wrong horse when they think that they find the answers in the nerves and in the brain. He says it would be like trying to understand a telephone call by knowing everything about the wires. He said this is the key is information. Where does the information come from? So it reminds me of always of the Sufi story of the Sufi fool Mullah Nasruddin, and the story says here is Mullah Nasruddin crawling on his knees under a lantern as if he were looking for something, and his neighbor comes and says, Mullah, what are you doing? Have you lost something? He says, yeah, I lost my keys. I says, well, can I help you? Well, sure. So the neighbor gets on the knees and both of them crawl and not finding anything. And the neighbor is puzzled and says, well, are you sure you lost it here? Yeah, I can't see anything. I can't find anything. And Mullah Nasruddin says, oh, not here, over there. Points to a sort of dark area out there. He says, well, if you lost it over there, why are you looking here? He says, well, there's dark there, we would not have a chance, you know, because here is light. So this is what we do, you know, we study the processes where we can get the answers. But if you ask the question, how does matter produce consciousness? We just simply don't know, you know, what to do with it. There was recently a statement by Stuart Hammer, a very famous brain researcher, who studied the so-called tubules, which are in mitochondria, which are subcellular structures in the brain. It's very, very interesting, beautiful structures. He said maybe consciousness somehow is created there by quantum processes, but we'll later find out, you know, how it is done. And then recently he changed his opinion. He said that according to his present belief, consciousness is simply a property of the universe, and that at least in the form of proto-consciousness, it can be traced all the way back to the Big Bang. This was a statement of a neuroscientist, basically accepting more or less how the Hindu religion would see that. The idea that what we perceive is Maya, is Lila. It's really not what we see is really not what reality is. And there are people like Amit Goswami, who is a professor of physics at the University of Oregon, who started something called Science of Consciousness. But the basic idea, if you think about it, is very interesting. We should actually start from consciousness, because what we know about the world is how we perceive the world. And Immanuel Kant has shown, you know, that there's a difference between phenomena and noumena, the way things appear to us and what things really are. What we really know is how things appear to us. What they really are is a big mystery. Astronomy is not a science about stars. Astronomy is a science about human experiences of what we call stars. Again, whether the stars are there or not is a very complicated question. It's very difficult to get somehow to bridge that gap from what's happening in the suboccipital cortex and our experience of the world. What?
What personality do you think about it? Does reality exist outside?
Well, something exists. You know, there's existence. There's something that you find in a system that I like very much, which is called Kashmir Shaivism. When they ask what is the creative principle in the universe, and they call it Shiva actually. It's not the Shiva of the Hindu pantheon. We had a hearing with a darshan with Lakshmanju, who was the main guru of this. And we asked him, why do you call it Shiva? He said, oh, the Indians like, the Indians like the name Shiva. But that Shiva is the principle, the creative principle of the universe. And when they explain what it is the fact of consciousness, not any specific content of consciousness. Now if you study existence, you find out there's existence itself, which is amazing. Why does anything exist at all? Why not non-existent? What happened there? So that's a fact. You can have many experiences in your meditation, in psychedelic sessions, in breath work, and there will be very convincing experiences of identifying with what you become. You can become a fetus, you can experience yourself as dancing Shiva, you can experience yourself as an elephant. So the interesting question is, what is the common denominator? you always exist. So existence is something that you cannot reduce to anything else. You always exist, no matter what you experience yourself as. There is always consciousness. In all those experiences, you are conscious. And then, obviously, you have this capacity of creating many different worlds, becoming many different things. So to them, these are the facts that are not reducible to anything else. Existence, consciousness, and this immense capacity of creating worlds, whether it's the world of archetypes or whether it's what we experience, the material world, or parallel universes or whatever it is. So for them, those are the facts that cannot be reduced any further. And I would have to say, to explain what I have experienced in these states and what I've seen in other people, I would have to go all the way to the spiritual philosophies of India. It would not be behaviorism, it would not be psychoanalysis or any of the theories that we have. None of those can really explain what is happening in these states. So that's consciousness. Then the second one is the cartography of the psyche. We have a model in psychology and psychiatry where the psychological life begins after we are born. We still buy somehow what Freud said, that the newborn is a tabula rasa. The newborn is a clean slate. There's nothing there of interest for psychologists, for psychiatrists, including birth itself. We ask our patients about birth, but the idea behind it is, if the birth was so bad that it damaged irreversibly the brain cell, then it matters. But we don't see even hours of birth to be a psychotrauma. This is not part of our conceptual framework. The memory of birth plays some kind of significant role in our unconscious. And if you work with these holotropic states, you will see daily people going back, regressing into the perinatal area, experiencing emotions and physical sensations related to the different stages of birth. So I had to initially, working with the Freudian concept, where it was just all postnatal, the first major step that I had to make is to include what I call the perinatal domain. I will show you later the scheme for the 4 matrices. When people have the experiences of reliving birth, it comes in 4 clusters, and they are meaningfully related to the consecutive stages of birth. But it doesn't even end there. There is, beyond this, a vast area, or beneath it is a vast area that we now call transpersonal. But there's major overlap with the Jungian concept of the collective unconscious. According to Jung, there's collective unconscious, which is historical, where we have the capacity in these non-ordinary states to experience anything that happened in human history. And there's another aspect of the collective unconscious, which you call archetypal, mythological, where we have access to the whole cultural heritage of humanity. We can experience archetypal figures from mythology of any culture that has ever existed, whether we know that culture intellectually or not. These were observations that led Jung to the idea that we don't have just the Freudian individual unconscious, which is basically a derivative of postnatal biography, things that we rejected, that we suppressed, that we couldn't accept, and so on. But that we have also this collective unconscious that has the historical and the archetypal domain. So we have to vastly expand the cartography to really have a more accurate understanding of what our psyche is like. Otherwise, the experiences that would be coming from the perinatal level and from the transpersonal level would be mislabeled as pathology, because we don't have a conceptual framework. We don't have a big enough cartography of the psyche to know that these are normal and germane dimensions that exist sort of in the depths of the unconscious. So experience of psychospiritual death and rebirth is not a pathological process. It's a healing process when it happens. Past life experiences are not psychotic experiences. It's something that people can have in these holotropic states, after 20 minutes of faster breathing. I mean, if we do breath work with this group, I mean, you would see, many people reliving birth and having prenatal experiences and past life experiences and archetypal experiences. And that doesn't mean that those people are crazy. It's simply they got access to deeper dimensions in the psyche that are not part of our agreed upon paradigm, agreed upon cartography of the psyche. But we find it in for example, in the Eastern systems, in Hinduism, in Buddhism, in Vajrayana, in Sufism. These people had centuries of intense exploration of the psyche. These are not fantasies, these are observations collected over many generations. Then the next one is the architecture of emotion and psychosomatic disorders. When we work on some problem, emotional, psychosomatic, even interpersonal, in traditional academic psychiatry, the idea is if it is not organic, it started after you're born. It started somewhere in infancy, in childhood. Actually, in classical psychoanalysis, there is this kind of dynamic taxonomy where you can link different emotional psychosomatic problems to a certain stage of libido development where there was fixation. So let's say alcoholism, addiction, manic depressive disorders would be seen as oral fixation. Obsessive compulsive neurosis started somewhere around the time of toilet training. It's an anal problem. Hysteria in classical analysis has two forms. It's anxiety hysteria, which are the different phobias, and then conversion hysteria. That supposedly started around the age of 4, when there was also the Oedipus complex and so on. Now, if you work with holotropic states, you will find out that there's always connection to your postnatal history, but that's just barely scratching the surface. There are additional, deeper roots that would link that problem to one of the perinatal matrices, to certain aspect of birth, and then very frequently even deeper roots that would be karmic, that would be archetypal or even phylogenetic. So it's a multi-level system which underlies these different problems. And to change somehow the situation in a reasonably short time, you have to, if you work on it, you have to allow yourself to go to all the levels from which the elements of these symptoms are coming, and you also have to have a context that allows that. You have to have a therapist that has a big enough cartography to support you when you are exploring those deeper roots. Now, what I just said looks like very bad news. We thought all we have to do is to work on our infancy and childhood, and everything's going to be fine. Now, this shows that the playground is much, much bigger. But the good news is that there are very powerful mechanisms of healing and transformation that exist on the perinatal level and the transpersonal level. For example, reliving birth and expressing the pent-up emotions which are on that level and releasing the blocked energies from that level can be very, very powerful therapeutic mechanism that has not been adequately acknowledged or recognized. Many problems can be resolved when people allow themselves to have experiences that seem like experiences coming from other lifetimes. In other words, experiences that take you to some other century to some other country with a very convincing feeling of déjà vu or déjà vécu. Like the sense that you recognize that experience, that you have been there before. You are now experiencing something that already happened in one of your previous lives. And here we are, of course, in the realm of reincarnation and karma. Again, something that existed in many different cultures, in many different historical periods, and those are all experiences that we can have. All of us can have in these non-ordinary states. There's nothing pathological about them, and we just simply have a too narrow cartography of the psyche to recognize that these are normal. They are not pathological states. Now the next one that's very, the point that's very important has to do with the strategy of self-exploration and psychotherapy. You know that we have an enormous number of schools of psychotherapy, and there's absolute lack of agreement among them as to, for example, what are the most important motivating forces in the psyche. Is it sex? Is it, as Freud thought, is it feelings of inadequacy, inferiority, and tendency to overcompensate it? As Adler thought, is it that our society doesn't let us sort of live our sex fully the way we are right? So, the culture, as Karen Horney saw it. Each system will give us a different understanding of the psyche, different way of interpret the same things, and a different method or technique to work with our clients. And some of the interesting studies that were done, for example, a study by Gerald Frank and Julia Frank, his daughter, from Johns Hopkins University, that they could not find any difference in therapeutic results between those schools. They actually found differences inside of the schools, that each school has a better therapist and not so good therapist, but they couldn't find any kind of statistically significant difference in the results between those schools. And the idea is that very likely something that works in psychotherapy is something that we don't talk about. That's very difficult to express in scientific terms. Something like the quality of the human encounter between the therapist and the client, or the feeling of the client of being unconditionally accepted by another human being, which most of the clients did not have in their own family, or even the feeling of having undivided attention of another human being. So the question is, what is the alternative? If it is not, correct understanding how the psyche functions and coming up with the interpretations, what is the alternative that these non-ordinary states have to offer? And it's quite interesting. It's when you go into this holotropic state, this non-ordinary state, it activates something like an inner radar that finds the content in the unconscious that has a strong emotional charge, and also is in a certain position to the threshold of consciousness that it's available on that particular day. In other words, something that has a strong emotional charge, which is emotionally relevant and is close to the surface, will automatically surface and will be available for processing, for working with it. So it's not our training, the school that we belong to, that decides what is relevant, what isn't relevant, but it's happening organically through this sort of inner healing intelligence. I'll give you an example from my own psychoanalysis to give you an idea what I'm talking about. I had a Freudian and a very Freudian analyst, training psychoanalysis for 7 years, 3 times a week. And there were several of us, the same age, young psychiatrists. Of course, we talked about our analysis once in a while. And my analyst at the time was probably in his 70s. And it was known about him that once in a while he fell asleep during the psychoanalysis, and you had to try to do something to bring him back into the process. And we talked about it and were making jokes about it. And we also had a chance to have seminars with him where we could ask theoretical questions. And one of us asked, what happens, just a purely theoretical question, what happens when the analyst falls asleep? If I keep free associating, does the process continue? Is it interrupted? You know, should you be refunded for the period? Money is so important. And of course, he couldn't say this kind of thing doesn't happen. He knew, so he had to do something with it. He was also Pavlovian. He was from Russia originally. And so he said, yeah, it can happen, you know. Sometimes you are tired, you are recovering from a flu, you haven't slept enough. Yeah, it can happen. But he said, but if you are in this business long enough, you fall asleep only when that stuff that's coming up is irrelevant. When something important comes up, you wake up and you're right there for your client. Well, relevant according to whom? According to Freudian, Adlerian, Sullivanian, Freudian, you know, Karen Horney. He was also, as I mentioned, Pavlovian. Pavlov talks about the inhibition of the cortex, like in hypnosis or in sleep. And he talks about the fact that you can maintain a waking point. And his famous example is a mother who sleeps through heavy noises, but when her own child starts moaning, she wakes up, it's right there. It's just like Pavlov's mother. But when something relevant comes up, you wake up and you're right there. So this property of the holotropic states to choose, you see, something that's emotionally relevant automatically and bringing it to the surface saves us this kind of a decision making. What in the narrative of the client is really important and what isn't important? What should we pay attention to? What should we interpret and so on? We simply work with the process as it is emerging. This is a very feminine way of working. Many people compare it with midwifery. If you are delivering a child, the intelligent process is there that knows how to deliver the baby. In the same way, if you are in these holotropic states, the organism knows how to free itself from the traumatic imprints, and it's up to us to try to intelligently cooperate with it. But we are not the fixers, we are not the doers that sort of have the idea about how things should happen, but simply support the process that is already happening. Now, I think it's already clear from what I said that the new psychology would have to have spirituality as an essential attribute of the human psyche and also the universal scheme of things. Because we have a paradigm that's dominated by monistic materialism, there is no place for spirituality. If you believe that this is a universe that created itself, and the history of the universe is the history of developing matter, and life, consciousness, intelligence happened, you know, more or less as flukes, you know, in an insignificant part of the universe after billions of years of development of matter. Then if somebody mentions spirit, you say, well, what do you mean spirit? What is spirit? Where is space for spirit or anything spiritual in a basically materialistic way of seeing the world? And again, when we work with the holotropic states, as the process reaches a certain level, the experiences have that quality that I already mentioned, which is luminosity. I mean, we have a sense that we are in a reality which is radically different from what we know from our everyday life, and that in a way it seems to be superordinated, forming and informing what is happening on this level. Very much like in Platonic philosophy, you have the idea of the forms or the ideas, or the Jungian idea of archetypes that really somehow influence on what's happening in our psyche as well as in the world. It was Jung's discovery of synchronicity that gave him this idea of the archetypal world being actually superordinated to everyday reality. When we have a synchronicity between an intrapsychic phenomenon like a dream or a vision and events in the exterior world, in the external world, then for Jung the explanation is that there is an archetype that influences both processes from a higher level, that are superordinated. What's happening in our psyche, what's happening in the external world, both is shaped by the archetypal dynamics. So we work with what we call the self-healing intelligence of the organism. That term therapeutes, as it was used in temple incubation in Greece, it meant a therapeutes, a therapist, was somebody who intelligently supports a healing process, but he was not the doer, it's not the fixer. This was happening from levels that we today would call archetypal, temple incubation. I will not go into this next one that would really open a can of worms. I have worked for 30 years now with Richtarnas, the brilliant psychologist, also brilliant astrologer, and he wrote a book, he wrote 3 books, but the one that's relevant in this context, New Paradigm Science. I had the great honor to be at the cradle of transpersonal psychology. When I came to the United States, I brought my material from Prague, research from Prague, and it was a big volume that has never been published and later became about five books. And I went to a place called SLM Institute, which I mentioned last night, a really amazing human laboratory, which is on the west coast of United States. And I gave a workshop there, and there was a man called Paul Herbert who was like a chronicler. You see, SLM at the time was like a real human laboratory where people were coming with all kinds of new ideas that were too much for universities, for research institutes, sort of official places, and people get the chance to experiment and share new ideas. And Paul Herbert was recording everything. He was like a chronicler. And when he heard my material, he said, what you are presenting is very much like what Abraham Maslow is talking about. Abraham Maslow was a very, very famous American psychologist who, among others, studied people who had spontaneous mystical experiences. Actually, after having a few experiences himself, and coined the term peak experiences. Experiences in which there is transcendence of time and space, and ecstatic emotions, sense of inability to express in language what happened, called ineffability. So we characterize sort of number of these characteristics of peak experiences, and carried research, so about 800 people, doing all the testing and realizing that these people were not psychiatric patients, that it was incorrect to call these experiences pathology, and wrote books about it. And I didn't know about it because as I was in Czechoslovakia, we had no access to American literature to speak of. And I was very surprised at what Paul Herbert told me. And Paul said, you know, you and Abe Maslow have to get together and sort of talk about the similarities of your work. So I sent Abe Maslow this manuscript, and I got a very enthusiastic letter, and he invited me to go and see him in Boston. And at the time when I was coming there, he was recovering from a heart attack. And as I came to his house and rang the bell, his wife, Bertha, came and answered the door. And I had this distinct feeling that I was not welcome. It was almost blocking the entrance into the house with her body, and then very reluctantly kind of stepped back. And I had no idea what was happening because we had never met. And you know, then she let me in, and we had many, many hours of very exciting discussion, finding the similarities between what he called the peak experiences, which were spontaneous experiences, and experiences that people had in psychedelic sessions. And then we had dinner, and then I understood why she didn't want me in the house. She said that when Abe read that manuscript and he saw the similarities, that he was getting so excited that she was afraid that when the two of us get together, it would be too emotional for him and dangerous, that he could have another heart attack. But then in the meantime, he got a wonderful scholarship and moved to California, and then invited me to be part of this small group that was working on this new psychology. Just to give you the historical context, in the first half of the 20th century, American psychology was dominated basically by two movements, by behaviorism and Freudian analysis. And in the 50s, more and more psychologists, psychiatrists were getting disenchanted by these two approaches. And Abe Maslow became like a spokesman for this rebellion, and he wrote a very incisive critique of both behaviorism and psychoanalysis. For behaviorism, you know, that idea that you can learn about human psychology by studying rats and pigeons. When you study rats and pigeons, you can find what we share with pigeons and rats, but you cannot really explain anything that's specifically human. He also criticized the fact that behaviorists refuse to look at any information that came from introspection, from consciousness. They wanted to eliminate consciousness from psychology. I can't resist to tell you a joke at this point, interrupt it for a moment. A joke that transpersonal psychologists make about behaviorists. And it goes like this: there's a couple, both of them behaviorists, and they make love in the bedroom. And when it's over, he looks at her and says, "It was fantastic for you. How was it for me?" So anyway, Abe's criticism went in that direction. And then he criticized psychoanalysis for basically trying to draw information about human psychology, mostly from patients, from people who had emotional problems. And he was very interested in looking actually in the other direction, to study people who were what he called the tip of the tip of humanity, people who were somehow exceptionally gifted, or with some very unusual abilities. And he found out that people who had these peak experiences and they managed to escape psychiatry and didn't get, you know, tranquilizers and diagnosed, and managed to integrate these experiences, they actually developed what we call self-actualization, self-realization, that they grew from these experiences. And so that was one reason, criticism of behaviorism and psychoanalysis, why he and Tony Sutic, another person, decided to create a new psychology. And Abe Maslow called behaviorism the first force in psychology, psychoanalysis the second force, and they created humanistic psychology, which was the third force. Humanistic psychology became very popular, both among professionals but also general population. There were very exciting conferences. But Abe Maslow and Tony Sutic, in the first 10 years of the existence of humanistic psychology, became dissatisfied themselves with the psychology that they created, and they realized they left out something very important, and that was the spiritual dimension, things that happen during spiritual practice, meditation, states of ecstasy, states of artistic inspirations. There were some significant things missing even in humanistic psychology. And so they started working on the fourth force. And when I joined the group, they had intention to call it transhumanistic, going even beyond humanistic. And then I brought in the psychedelic material that I was talking about yesterday, and I had a large category of experiences that I called transpersonal. And then they actually loved that term and then replaced the transhumanistic with the term transpersonal psychology. And we had meetings. One of the meetings was a European guest, Viktor Frankl, came from Vienna and participated in one of those meetings. Otherwise, it was a small group of Americans and myself. And we got to the point where we felt that we had a psychology that made a lot of sense, that didn't make psychotics out of every founder of religion and shaman, and that was integrating these observations from the study of holotropic states, treated ritual and spiritual life of humanity with respect rather than pathologizing it. But we had great problems because we had no idea how we could possibly bridge the gap between what we felt was relevant, a useful psychology, and what we were taught at the university, what was considered to be the scientific worldview. And we struggled with it for a while. And then something very important happened. Fritjof Capra, a physicist, published a book which was called The Tao of Physics. That became really a turning point, which actually is the title of this next book, The Turning Point. And he came to Tiburon, which is near where we live, and Francis Vaughan, another transpersonal psychologist, had a party for him, and we all met Fritjof Capra, and there he shared his insights, which was that for the last 300 years, Western science had been dominated by what he called the Cartesian-Newtonian paradigm, which was a bit of Newton, a bit of Descartes, and then monistic materialism was grafted on it. Now, neither Newton nor Descartes were materialists themselves, so it was like a, just a part of their thinking. The biographer of Newton called Newton the last magician rather than the first great scientist, because he was interested in astrology, in palmistry, in alchemy, and whatever he discovered scientifically seemed to him perfectly compatible with these esoteric systems. And Descartes got the idea for discours de la méthode, which became the basis of the Cartesian thinking. He got it actually in a dream in a dream. The inspiration came from a visionary state. Now, what Fritjof was saying, for the last 300 years, Western science has been dominated by this way of thinking. Cartesian Newtonian paradigm married to monistic materialism. And then what happened since basically the turn of the centuries, from the 19th to the 20th century, is that major revolution happened in physics. Up to that time, physicists, because this was a material system, the universe was a material system, the physicists were considered to be the major experts about reality. And everything that the people discovered in the other disciplines had to be consonant with what the physicists were saying. But now what happened in physics, radioactivity was discovered, X-rays, Röntgen was discovered, and they started bombarding the atoms, and they were finding that the atoms were not empty. And actually, that's the first model that came out of this work was the planetary model, where the atom was not a solid ball. Atomos means something that cannot be cut any further. Temnein is to cut. So these indestructible billiard balls suddenly were empty. And this planetary model of the atom emerged, and Fritjof gave this example to show how much stuff, how much matter physics lost just in the first step from the atom to the planetary model, and ask us to imagine that the atom is blown to the size of a Gothic cathedral. And in that model, the nucleus would be like a pinhead, and the electrons would be like dust, sort of whirling somewhere where the walls are. And the inside of the cathedral was how much matter, stuff, physics lost just with this first step. And of course, then it turned out the nucleus was not solid. There were protons and neutrons and so on, and then it went further to quarks, and then, when quantum physics came, ultimately the matter was empty, and on the subatomic level, you can't even say whether something is there. There's certain probabilities, that something is there, and everything disappears into the dynamic vacuum, and you can sort of, in the collision chambers, you can create particles, and particles disappear. And not much was left with this sort of solid, kind of Newtonian Cartesian model. But the members of the other disciplines who originally modeled themselves after Newton, because that became the model of scientific thinking, they did not really follow. They still remained stuck in the 17th century thinking. And so Fritjof showed that actually quantum relativistic physics created a perspective on the universe which was very, very close to what we find in the great spiritual philosophies of the East. It's like what's called the Tao of physics, and on the cover, you probably have seen, it had the Nataraja, the dancing Shiva, against the background of the pictures of the collisions of the particles in the accelerator. And for us, that was extremely revealing. We realized we were trying to reconcile transpersonal psychology with the 17th century model that the physicists themselves had abandoned, and that what we have to look at is the connection now between transpersonal psychology and what became known as the new paradigm, the major new breakthroughs that were coming. And one of the most exciting first discoveries in this was the discovery of holography. I'd just like to show you how the hologram and the holographic thinking in the work of David Bohm and Carl Pribram, who had actually a holographic model of the brain, how it helped us to bridge between transpersonal psychology and science, not the Cartesian-Newtonian, but the new science. So I have here a model of how you make a hologram. The mathematics that underlies holograms was discovered by a Hungarian scientist living in London, Denis Gabor, and it was part of his effort to actually improve the electronic microscope, and created mathematics that became the basis for holography at a time when it was not possible to make a hologram because it required laser, and that didn't exist at the time. And then when in Malibu and Los Angeles they discovered laser, then they could use these principles to actually create optical holograms. So why was this so exciting? Why was it such an interesting model that seemed to throw a lot of light on something that seemed nonsense, something that the mystics were saying? Things like, you know, each of us is an insignificant part of the universe, but then each of us is the whole universe. Or we are separate from each other, but we are all one. So, you know, don't you know Aristotelian logic? And you have to decide, are you part, or are you all? Are you separate, or are you one with the person? They were talking in paradoxes that didn't make any sense to people who were traditionally trained. So now how the hologram helped us to think about this? If you make a hologram, you need a source of laser. This is on the upper right. A laser technically is light, which is coherent, which means that the rays are not vibrating in all directions, but they are in steps. And it's monochromatic, which is just one color, which is all the same frequencies or the same wavelengths, which is just an inverse value. So we have light, which is very powerfully concentrated, which is coherent, which is monochromatic, and you send it against glass, which is half covered with silver. If the glass is completely covered with silver, it becomes a mirror. It reflects everything. If there's no silver, all the light goes through. But what we have, for example, in one-way screens, there is a partial coverage with the silver plating, and this is what's happening here, that half of the beam gets through and the other half is reflected. And then the one that goes through, this is called the beam splitter. It splits the beam into two. The part that goes through the light is then directed through the system, goes also through another device which is called spreader, beam spreader. It kind of creates a kind of a spectrum, and this goes against a film plate, and then the other half of the beam is reflected from the object. In this case it looks like an apple, and then reflected from that object, it also hits the same plate, film plate. So what you get on the plate is what's called an interference pattern. Like when you, for example, would throw pebbles into a pond, you get these waves, and they would interfere. If you get two crests, you create a bigger crest. If there is a crest and wave and trough meeting, they will cancel each other. And what happens in the hologram, that the amplitude is related to light. If you get a big crest, it's a point of light, if the waves cancel themselves, you get the dark parts, and then you get this kind of pattern that you see, kind of a moire pattern. And all holograms look the same. No matter what you take a picture of, you always get these concentric circles. Very different from ordinary photography. If you have a negative of a picture that you've taken, you can still tell what is there. There are people there, there are trees there, houses. You just get it inverted. But the holograms, they all look the same, like what you see here. In other words, you cannot tell just by looking at the hologram what is on it. Now, the holograms have some amazing capacities. One is that they have great storage capacity. When you can, if you have a regular film, you can just get one picture there. When you have a hologram, you can put a lot of pictures into the same film. And you can do it in two different ways. One is that with each exposure, you would change the angle of the laser. For example, we could take one person after another, bring them into this holographic system, and with each person we would change the angle, and then we develop the film, and then as we illuminate the developed film with laser, as we are changing the angle, one person after another kind of emerge from the hologram. We can also do it with different colors, each frequency for the third person, and when we change the frequencies, we draw out number of three-dimensional images from the same film. We can also do it so that we don't change the angle. One person after another comes to the system and we do sequential exposures, and then we illuminate and we get one figure, one person, and it would have the information about all those people packed into that space. Now, this is very different from the Newtonian world, where objects displace each other. You can't put two objects in the same place. You can put, any number of images into the same hologram. So there's this enormous storage capacity. Now, another thing, if we have a regular film and we cut it in half, we lose half of the information. The hologram can be cut in 100 pieces, and you illumine each of those pieces with laser, and you can still get the whole. So this is now transcending that Aristotelian problem, that in a sense a part can represent the whole. The information is distributed in the whole system. Gregory Bateson used to give the example of a spider, where you have a spider web, and the spider sits there with 8 legs, and then when a fly flies into the net, the spider is kind of reading the vibrations, and because the information is in the whole net, can perfectly locate where the fly is. So this way you can get out of the same hologram. From each fragment, you can get the whole picture. You lose something in this process, which is the resolution, which means the textures will not be so fine, but you never lose the whole. So that the whole, in a sense, is contained in every part. So when the mystics say, each of us is an insignificant part of the universe, but each of us is the whole, it makes a lot of sense in holographic language. And when they say in the esoteric system, each of us is a microcosm containing the macrocosm, it also makes a sense. Now, what is this about? When we talk about us being an insignificant part of the universe, we are talking about what we can measure and weigh. And since Galileo, this is what science is interested in. Only what you can measure and what you can weigh. You don't just look at the other qualities. So in terms of our body, our size, our weight, we are an insignificant part of a universe that has, billions of galaxies. But we are the whole thing in terms of being able to experience ourselves as any part of the universe. In other words, this is a discussion about information that we can get, not about weight and size. For example, I can experience myself as an elephant in a psychedelic session. Now, it doesn't mean that when you put me on a scale, I'm going to weigh 3 tons. It's going to be substantial, but not 3 tons. What it says, I have the capacity of becoming an elephant experientially. And because each of us has in principle, the possibility to experience ourselves as anything that's part of the universe, including the universe itself, that we were talking about it yesterday. In that sense, we are, each of us is the whole universe. Same when we talk about, being separate or being one, we are talking about the same thing. First, in terms of what we can weigh, what we can measure, and what we can experience. I can experience myself as being one with any of you in a psychedelic session. And this is one of the very common types of experiences, that we become other people, or we can become a group of people and so on. Now, in terms of the holography, where you don't change the angles, that points to another very interesting aspect of the hologram, and that is that you can get a picture of a person that occupies the space of one body, but you can get the information about all the people whose pictures, whose information was fed into the hologram. So I spent some time in Hawaii, where they have a great holographic laboratory at the university. And they had, for example, a picture which was called The Child of Hawaii. And you look at it and it's just sort of one child, but as you are kind of looking at it, different Hawaiian children are sort of coming out and looking at you from something that occupies just the space of one child. And the information is there, and with different angles and different focusing, you can really find many, many children in that same hologram. I don't know if you watch Star Trek here, Starship Enterprise. Anybody watch it there? Yeah, so there was one episode where there was an alien entity that was on board of the Enterprise, and could take on shapes of all the members of the crew that was in part of the plot. And somehow towards the end they managed to get the creature and zap her with lasers. And as she was dying, it was a she, as she was dying, you could see the different faces of the crew members that she impersonated, coming out of it. A similar picture was in this was, I think, Terminator 2, which was this creature that was created out of liquid nitrogen and could take forms of different people. And fighting with Arnold Schwarzenegger, and somehow got her at the end, into a pot with hot iron. And again, as it was melting in that fire, these different faces were coming out of it. Now, one of the things they were doing in this laboratory in Honolulu was they were offering a special favor, a gift to newlyweds, that they would make a hologram of them, and they could choose whether they wanted this as a more conventional picture where you can see two of them as separate beings in 3 dimensions, of course, or you can choose a picture when you are kind of in a tantric fusion, when you have just one body, both of you kind of fusing together. Now, if you make a hologram, you can make a hologram in such a way that you see it through the film on which the hologram is. But you can also make a hologram of a hologram, and you get what's called the projection hologram, when it comes out and it's kind of hanging in the air, and you can go around it and look from all angles. And let's say if the person had glasses, from different angles you can see different pictures in the glasses. Or if the person has a diamond ring, as you walk around it, it's throwing different facets. So we can imagine that we have now a projection hologram showing a bridal couple. Okay? We have 2 new members here. And if it were really a good hologram, it could fool a lot of people. If you don't know it's a hologram, you can easily get fooled. In the early years of holography, there was a jeweler in New York City who had a projection hologram of a hand with a beautiful pearl necklace that kind of was reaching into the street. And you could see people walking by and sort of reaching for it, and of course there was nothing there, it was a hologram. So if we had a projection hologram, and people who would not know that they are dealing with holography, especially, let's say, children, or you would bring a pygmy who have never seen a hologram, they would see this as 2 separate entities, 2 separate beings. Now, if you are more sophisticated and you know something about holography, you know that the holographic images cannot stand on their own. There has to be more to create holographic images. There has to be the ocean of light out of which they emerge through interference, and there also has to be something that gives the diffraction, that gives the shape, like what we have in the movies when we use the celluloid and we sort of create the images. So the holographic images need a matrix, a creative matrix. And there are now 2 ways of looking at this. Really the simple-minded, when you perceive it as separate object, or the sophisticated, when you understand that under the separation there is a unity, there is a unified field. Now this can be then applied to the world. David Bohm, who was a co-worker of Albert Einstein and wrote a book both on the theories of relativity and quantum physics, he had a theory of hollow movement where the basic idea was that what we experience here is like holograms. He called it the unfolded order or the explicate order. And for it to exist, it has to have, again, the deeper matrix, the creative matrix, undifferentiated matrix, that would be coming from a dimension that we cannot directly perceive unless we are in a holotropic state of consciousness. And that's what he called the implicate or the enfolded order. So, looking at the world, it doesn't take a lot of brain to perceive the world as being made of separate objects. This is the naive, this is the pedestrian perception of the world. To understand that there is underlying unity behind the world of separation, that takes some doing. I mean, you have to be a quantum relativistic physicist, or you have to be somebody like Whitehead, you know. Or you you go into some of the Eastern philosophies to understand it. So we were very, very excited about this, how we solved some of the seemingly nonsensical statements of the mystics. We are all one. We are insignificant parts of the universe, but each of us is the whole universe. But this is really important to understand that one part of the statement talks about the world that we can measure and weigh, and that other part of the equation is our experiential capacity, how we can experience the universe, how much of the universe we can experience in these non-organic states. So I thought you might be interested in this model that somehow helps people with academic background to sort of see that there might be more than some kind of a nonsense that these people are talking about. And this was the beginning for us, and then new discoveries were coming. Second excitement was for the third, after Fritjof Capra and this David Bohm and Karl Pribram, who were actually friends, who were working together on the holographic model of the brain and holographic model of the universe. Then the next sensation was Rupert Sheldrake, who he was living in India in the Shantivana ashram near Madras. He created a book called New Science of Life, where he talks about morphogenetic field, quite revolutionary theory, showing that science, materialistic science, has never really addressed adequately such problems as where does form come from in the universe? Where does meaning come from? We just sort of describe the material in science, the atoms, how our atoms are composed and so on. But nobody is really addressing in science the question that the universe, there is more than the atoms. I mean, there's a beauty. I mean, the beauty of Polynesian islands is compared to the beauty of the Arctic. Where does that come from? Where do the forms come from? How come there is meaning in the world when it's just a play of atoms and so on? And so he had the idea of the morphogenetic fields, which are sort of immaterial fields that answer some of these questions. And another contribution was systems theory, like Eric Jansch, now he developed into the work of Erwin Laszlo, which is the most advanced model in systems theory, where he had the concept of what he initially called the psi field, PSI, and then started using the term Akashic field that really, again, bridged into the Eastern spiritual systems. The idea behind it is mind-blowing, is that whatever happens in the universe remains holographically recorded in a subquantum field, so that it still is available. And in holotropic states of consciousness, we can visit these archives, these cosmic archives. So the first time I had some concept, how is it possible that I can have a psychedelic session and suddenly be in ancient Egypt, or be in French Revolution, what is that about? And that concept that he has, which is not a fantasy, again, there is a book that he wrote, the Interactive Universe, he gives the mathematics and the physics of that. But a very, very exciting way of relating to the fact that we can have all these amazing experiences from other historical periods, whether they have that quality of past life experiences or whether it seems just like visits to other historical periods and other countries and so on. So what has been really exciting from the time when transpersonal psychology came into being, that whenever there was a breakthrough, we could talk about chaos theory, fractals and so on, whenever there was some breakthrough in science, it was always accepted with great excitement in the transpersonal circles, and it always was some kind of a major correction of the old thinking. We actually talked about this. Okay, these are the perinatal matrices that I mentioned last night. I talked about the fact that if we do work with holotropic states, that we cannot do it with current model of psychology, psychiatry, because that's limited to postnatal biography and to the Freudian individual unconscious, and the experiences, whether they are induced by breathwork or by psychedelics, or whether they happen spontaneously, they simply will not stay in that very narrow range of postnatal biography and the individual unconscious. And I talked about the fact that the first surprise that came is when we found out that there is a very, very powerful record of birth, the different stages of birth. And I mentioned that when people regress to the level of birth, that the experiences come in 4 experiential clusters, characterized by specific emotions, by specific physical feelings, physical sensations, and that each of them is also like a selective opening into the next level, which is the transpersonal level, either the historical collective unconscious or the archetypal collective unconscious, and I gave a few examples of that. So I'll talk first a little about the anatomy and physiology, and then show you how the symbolism of these matrices is meaningfully connected with biology, with physiology, without wanting to reduce what you are going to be seeing and what we are going to be talking about, without wanting to reduce it to biology. It's not that the birth is source of those images. It's more than actually the matrices are expressions of archetypal forces. We talk about it a little yesterday. Like I mentioned, the astrological archetype. The first matrix will be like a Neptunian archetype, the second will be like a Saturnian archetype, the third the Plutonic archetype, the fourth the Uranian archetype. But initially, because I was coming from medicine, from biology, when I discovered that birth was there, which for me was a surprise, because that's not something that was taught in the medical school. There was a tendency to reduce everything to biology, because it was a material system. But then, as we continued, it became clear that actually what's happening on the biological level is formed and informed from the archetypal level. It's not the source of those kinds of images that we'll be seeing. So I started talking about these experiential patterns as basic perinatal matrices, or BPM 1, 2, 3, 4. It could get confusing because there are 4 perinatal matrices and 3 stages of birth. The first matrix is a situation of advanced pregnancy before the delivery actually starts. The second matrix is the first stage of delivery, and so on. And the third matrix is the second stage, and the fourth matrix is the third stage. So maybe I'll talk about first picture, second picture, rather than mentioning the numbers, because it could get confusing. So on the first picture, we see the fetus still in the womb in an advanced stage of pregnancy prior to the onset of delivery. Now there's a wide range of possibilities. You know, this could be a situation where the child is in the womb of a mother who is physically healthy, who is in an emotionally good condition, a decent marriage, the child is planned, the parents are looking forward to the birth of the child. Now that kind of experience, when we go back there, would be a very ecstatic, very wonderful kind of experience. Now this is unfortunately not always the case. The pregnancy could be also a result of rape. It could be a result of a one-night stand where both parents were drunk. The mother could have been sick. The mother could have deep depressions and anxiety states or some other psychological problems. There could be toxicosis that was happening. The child could have been so unwanted that there were attempts at abortion that the child survived. And we work with somebody who goes back into a womb that is absolutely hostile. Besides actually interventions, toxic or mechanical intervention to terminate the pregnancy, there's also something called RH incompatibility, where the mother is RH negative, the child is RH positive. You all understand what I'm talking about, yeah? Mm-hmm. There are razors like that.
Chodzi o konflikt serologiczny pomiędzy matką RH minus a dzieckiem RH plus.
So that's a situation where the fetus is perceived as an intruder into the organism of the mother, and the immunological system actively would attack the child, and this tighter the amount of the antibodies increases with each pregnancy. So if the third pregnancy, the child might not survive that without some medical interventions. So you could have grown in a hostile womb, a womb that was actually attacking you, trying to get rid of you. Now, whether this was a good womb or not so good womb, come 9 months, plus minus, the situation changes, first hormonally, and then the hormonal influences are translated into actual mechanical contractions of the uterus. Now the way the uterus is built, it has muscular fibers. Some of them are circular, some of them are spiral, some of them are longitudinal, and the arteries are coming into the uterus from the base, which here would be at the top, because I wanted people to see the expression in the face of the fetus, which was not happening when it was upside down. So the arteries are coming from the base, which is at the top, and they have a kind of winding course between the muscular fibers. So every time the uterus is contracting, it's cutting off the blood supply, the flow of blood between the mother and the child, which is the meaningful connection between the mother and the child. So there's a sense of being completely cut off from the mother, in addition to experiencing lack of oxygen, experiencing lack of nourishment, and also having the inability to dispose of the metabolic product. So for the time of the contractions, this is a very unpleasant situation. And it is a situation where the system is closed. The cervix is not open, but with every contraction the cervix is being pulled over the head and is dilating, as it is called, until it reaches a size where now the continued contractions can actually propel the child through the birth canal. Now here we have enormous pressures, clashing pressures. The head is wedged into the opening of the pelvis. The pressure has been computed to oscillate between 50 and 100 pounds. Enormous pressure. Excuse me. And we can have all kinds of additional problems here. For example, the umbilicus can be, the umbilical cord can be too short. It can be twisted around the neck. It can get between the head and the side of the birth canal. There could be various discrepancies between the size of the child and the size of the opening. And in the extreme, the placenta can actually block the way out, and that's placenta previa. Then it effectively changes the third matrix into the second. It's a no exit situation, and it has to be solved by caesarean section. And here we have another very important element that's important for understanding the pictures that you will see, that somehow this third matrix situation, through the choking, through the pain, tends to generate energy which is indistinguishable from sexual arousal, powerful sexual energy, which means that, we have had our first encounter with sexual type of energy before we were even born. So this is more radical than Freud, who took it from puberty to the breast. The idea here, we already had this encounter with sexual energy in the birth canal as we were being born. This is then extremely important for understanding various sexual deviations, aberrations, perversions, and so on. Because this first encounter with sexual energy is happening in a situation where we inflict pain on another organism, on the mother. Another organism, the mother, is inflicting pain on us. We cannot breathe, we are bound, we are under a lot of pressure, and we are also in contact with various forms of biological material, anything from blood, the amniotic fluid, to feces and urine that can be in certain kinds of deliveries where there was no enema, and there was no catheter. So here you have like the basic building blocks for all kinds of sexual problems that Krafft-Ebing called psychopathia sexualis. So people who need the combination of being choked and sexual arousal. The experiments with ischemia and sex frequently end up in death, which is not a suicide but is a mishap. The most recent case that I remember was David Carradine, who was found naked. So those are practices or bondage syndrome, where people want to be bound and choked, or they do something themselves, put a scarf around their throat and put it on a doorknob and masturbate it. So, or sexual situation is connected with the need to hurt another person or being hurt. All kinds of sadomasochistic practices or situations where people feel the need to bring actually biological material into the sexual situation. We have names for all these different aberrations. So it's important to know that when you are reliving this stage, suddenly you encounter a lot of images involving sex, and it's not the best form of sexuality. It's not a situation where it's Romeo and Juliet, we see walking on a meadow, buttercups and a beautiful blue sky, and they have this great emotional connection and spiritual connection, and they end up making love somewhere in a forest of birch trees. You get the heavy stuff, you get images of red light district, various kind of aberrations, criminal sexuality, rape, and so on. And as part of this matrix. And as I said, it is also a deep source of these aberrations that actually are not sexuality, but they are somehow tendencies to recreate the situation in the birth canal, that sexual arousal was associated with all these other things. And it is ultimately a healing impulse. It's misunderstood. Because if the situation would be created by the person's unconscious, then it would lead into movement into the next stage. It would lead to spiritual opening. But if the person is not in touch with it, not with the level where it's coming from, and is simply acting it out in everyday life, they get stuck in that place and never result. They don't move out of that place. But they feel this strong need to repeat that situation. Freud called this repetition compulsion, when we have this kind of tendency to repeat some old situation. And now we come to the transition from 3 to 4, which can happen head first or feet first. Then the umbilical cord is cut, either instantly or after it stops pulsating. It depends on the philosophy of the obstetrician and also the circumstances. Now, and we come to the experiential part. This is the anatomy, the physiology. Now, experientially, in holotropic states, we can identify with the fetus in all these stages. We really feel the body image of the fetus, even the discrepancy between the size of the head and the body. We can taste the amniotic fluid, and then we can experience whatever the pregnancy was like, from the very blissful kind of oceanic type of experience to a situation of feeling poisoned, feeling threatened, or if it's an attempt, mechanical attempt at abortion, it's that kind of a bloody apocalypse that can happen. Now, if it's a good womb, then we have the fetus, you see, in this oceanic setting, and it can actually open up into an experience of being in the ocean, being some kind of aquatic creature, becoming a dolphin, a whale, even a kelp or a jellyfish. It can also open into space, into cosmic space. So you go from the fetus to being in the cosmos, basically. It can open up into a situation where it's coming from the collective unconscious, which is archetypal. And this would be images of various paradises or heavens. And you can experience paradises of cultures that you have never studied. I remember one case in Prague where a person was experiencing himself as a fetus in a good womb, and suddenly it opened up and he was a spirit in the luster of Aurora Borealis. And there were other spirits, and there was energy happening, and something was flying around, and he realized that they were playing with the head of a walrus. And I was very Freudian at the time. We tried free associations, didn't get very far. And then when I was in San Francisco, there was a great bookstore, Fields bookstore. I used to go there and just sort of look, if I can find something interesting. And suddenly there was a mythology of the Eskimo people, and this was their description of paradise. You die, you become a spirit, and you go and play with other spirits in the Aurora Borealis with the head of a walrus, and the energy of the place creates the Northern Lights. aurora borealis, without the person knowing it intellectually, without me having any idea what this was. You know, that was an experience of the Eskimo paradise, or heaven. This is what brought Jung to the concept of collective unconscious, when he realized that in the dreams of his patients, or visions of his patients, there were elements of mythologies that they didn't know, and in many instances Jung didn't know. This can also open into beautiful nature. For example, the closest experience you could have as an adult of the first matrix would be to go to Polynesian island. You take something like go to Fiji and take the Blue Lagoon cruise, where they take you to these unspoiled islands and take you surfing or scuba diving. The sharks are well fed, you know, nobody's afraid of sharks there. That's the beauty of the oceanic situation. So it can also open into that kind of situation. You can become a native on the Polynesian island before the missionaries got there. You didn't have to wear any clothes. The temperature was just fine. You didn't have to work hard. Nature was providing, Mother Nature was providing unconditionally, and you just were singing and dancing. You were having a great time for most of the time. So it's another possibility how the first matrix can be experienced. Now we come to the transition from 1 to 2. That's typically experienced as engulfment. You feel suddenly something closing in, and you are trapped. Sometimes it's experienced as a gigantic whirlpool that is drawing you to its center. Or it could be being swallowed by a leviathan or some archetypal creature, or octopus can appear. We'll see spider can be a very, tarantula can be a very appropriate symbol here. We have these two types of freedom in the first matrix. One is the oceanic. So something like the whirlpool or the octopus would be specific danger for the bliss, the oceanic bliss. And then we have the other one, which is the cosmic freedom. We can imagine a fly or a butterfly. The whole world belongs to them until they fly into a spider web, and then it's over. Then the system closes, and then their life is threatened. So those are all archetypal images that appear in the context of these stages of birth. The fully developed second matrix is really like hell. It's a very unpleasant emotional feeling, very unpleasant physical feeling, and you lose linear time. So it seems like this will never end. In time or space, it will never end, and the system will not open. You are trapped there forever. There is a trias that people experience. I'm going crazy. I'm in hell. This will never end. And the other one is I'm going to die here. This is the end of my life. These are some of the worst bad trips that people can have. And paradoxically, the way out of it is to go deeper into it. When you are at a certain level of the second matrix and you want to be out, you're really not dealing with the depths of the pain or the despair, which would then lead to the point where it moves into the next stage. You're sort of dealing out the end point of the second matrix. So that's a difficult task for the sitter, for the therapist, to convince people that they will get better if they become worse first. This is a pattern that underlies inhibited depression, where people feel cut off from the world. They are surrounded by people who love them and they cannot relate to them in any way. They have a sense of hopelessness, no exit kind of a situation. Many people resonate very deeply with existential philosophers. You know, we come into this world naked, frightened, without any possessions, and this is how we are going to leave. And no matter what we do in our life or with our life, cannot change it. The beginning and the end are the same. We're dealing with birth and death at the same time, and what is in between doesn't seem to make sense. It's a meaningless world. Some people have the feeling of being like in the world of Kafka. Franz Kafka very frequently mentioned.
Do you have also positive examples of sentiment, or you have only negative?
Not really. I mean, you know, if you, I mean, the best you can come is with the admiring the artistic ability to portray such hopeless situation. I mean, it, you know, it could be so bad that you admire the mastery with which the desperation is portrayed, but emotionally you cannot really get anything positive out of it. So now we have the third matrix. In the second matrix, you have access only to the role of the victim. If there are images of war, you're always the ones who are getting it, or sort of hiding somewhere and there are air raids or attacks. You have no way of fighting back. This is the archetype of the victim. This is the archetype of the underdog that we call, I don't know, the Polish underdog. That's not what it is. There's an alpha dog and there's the underdog, the last. You are always the victim, the downtrodden, the beaten. No way of fighting back. This changes in the third matrix, where you also get access to expressing aggression. And as we will see in the pictures, if we can get to the point where we are in depression, and we start getting access to expression of aggression, that's the turning point of depression. Freud wrote this book called Mourning and Melancholia, when he expressed the idea that depression is really aggression that is turned against us. It's the aggression that we cannot express towards the outside world, so it kind of boomerangs and we become victims of that. The extreme of aggression is murder, the extreme of depression is also murder. We kill ourselves. So when we get to the point where we open that system and we start experiencing aggression, that's where we start healing this type of depression, which is we call inhibited depression. Then in the third matrix, the powerful forces, clashing forces. There could be images of battles, for example, where we have now three roles. We can be the victim, we can be the aggressor, we can also observe it. And the kind of battles that would be portrayed here are like the battles, you know, in the First World War, when you have the equal chance to be hurt or hurting the opponent, like when they were taking the trenches with bayonets, for example, or gladiator combats, or the kind of battles like in El Cid, where you have two medieval armies clashing, and then you're chopping and being chopped, and you know, you're both victim and aggressor. As it is in the birth canal, again, you have both of those hurting and being hurt. At the same time, there is a difference here because there is perspective. In the second matrix, it's hopeless. Here, it might be tough, but there is a chance and there is a way out. Now, in terms of there's a relationship to those archetypes, as we talked about it, the astrological archetypes, but there's also connection, very interesting connection, to some of the abodes of the beyond. Let's say the first one is related to heaven and paradise. the transition from 1 to 2 is like paradise lost. The second one is no exit, is hell. I might have mentioned it here in Dante's Divine Comedy when Virgilius takes Dante to the gate of hell. There is an inscription, lasciate ogni speranza voi che entrate, abandon all hope, you who enter here. It's a hopeless place, suffering that will never end. The third matrix in this kind of imagery would be purgatory, suffering with perspective. If you suffer enough, things will somehow get better. So there is a certain hope. It's not a snake pit, you know, there's an opening. There's a light at the end of the tunnel, those kinds of images. And then I already mentioned the sexual imagery, which would be here. And then towards the end, as we are coming out, we can identify with various archetypal beings representing death and rebirth. We have seen many instances where people identify with Jesus at this point, Jesus on the cross, which is our own image for death and resurrection. But it could be from any mythology. It could be Osiris, it could be Attis, Adonis, even from mythology that you don't know. Then a typical element in the transition is also fire, kind of purifying fire. In German, for example, purgatory is called Fegefeuer, sweeping, cleansing fire. And then the opening is emerging into light, golden light, white light. It could be peacock designs, rainbow spectra, images of some archetypal deities appearing in light, Great Mother images and so on. So this is now the symbolism, and we'll go to the images now that will communicate it much better than my words can. Now, what we have here first is a powerful journey of one woman who was a very skilled artist, Harriet Sharana Francis, and she, thank you, she wrote a book, Visionary Journey. I wasn't the one who was sitting for her. This happened in the 60s in Menlo Park. There was a program of LSD therapy. But she asked me when she was writing the book to write a preface, so I spent a lot of time with her talking about the experiences, and I wrote the preface. And the book is called Drawing It Out, and you can buy it if you are interested. Now I have first 2 pages of kind of synoptic images, where you get a sense for the logic, for the unfolding of those experiences. And then I will take one picture after another, and I will say something about it. Now, as you're watching it, realize that we are now exploring domains, which will be the perinatal and the transpersonal, which are not recognized in current psychiatry and psychology as sort of germane domains in the psyche. We have the model which starts after we are born. At this point, she's delving into levels of the psyche that the current psychiatry does not recognize. Because psychiatrists know that these kinds of images can come, but at this point, people would get a diagnosis. The idea that this is not the psyche per se, that some kind of pathological process yet to be identified in the future is intervening in, is creating these kinds of images now. If you have those experiences, you realize the beauty, the artistic beauty of that whole realm. The idea that this could be created by some pathological process is simply bizarre. It just doesn't make any sense. It's just overwhelming beauty of the archetypal realm. Okay, there's a suggestion that we do this whole thing after a coffee break. Is that general agreement?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Teraz zrobimy 15-minutową przerwę.
Okay, so this is the first picture. Many of the sessions with low dosages of LSD or beginning of high dose sessions, which was here, have very rich imagery which is abstract, geometrical patterns, very rich colors, very dynamic, where people talk about kaleidoscopic displays. They talk about the fact that it's like stained glass windows in Gothic cathedrals or arabesques. Those of us who had these experiences, when we saw fractals, we said, this is it, we saw fractals. Everybody knows what fractals are? Computer-generated images. It's a graphic representation of equations that are called nonlinear. And when you get the graphic representation, it's a very complex geometrical pattern. And if you go to higher magnifications or lower magnifications, the pattern repeats itself with variations. And there are very many types of them. There's the Julian set, there's the Mandelbrot set, and so on. You can buy some of them on a video. Some of my friends, buy these and they watch them and play music and smoke a joint and remember the 60s. Very much like having a psychedelic experience when you watch a fractal display. But it is just the most superficial layer of psychedelic experience when you have these kinds of images. Although in the 60s that became like a symbol of psychedelia, wild colors, patterns, and so on. But it's just an interface before the really important things start happening. Fractals are related to the theory of chaos, really, and you get this where the organization of the material where it starts disintegrating and you start entering your own psyche, your own unconscious, which is happening here. She now feels oppressed, pressure on the chest, and there's a kind of anxious anticipation there. And this is then the experience of the world as she knows it falling apart, the Newtonian world falling apart. As you can see, she doesn't like it particularly, she's trying to stop it, but there's no good way of stopping a psychedelic experience. When people have difficult experiences, the absolutely worst thing you can do for them is what's being done routinely, which is give them tranquilizers. What happens is that you freeze it there and you prevent resolution. You want to hold people's hand and say, you are in an LSD session, this is a matter of time, I'll be here with you, just go with it. And some of the worst experiences can turn out to be the most positive, most transforming, because it's not the LSD experience, it means that you're dealing with some very difficult aspect of your unconscious when you start having so-called bad trips. So it's also an opportunity for some major breakthrough, and it's a shame to put tranquilizers there and freeze people when this difficult material is close to the surface and keep it there. Now she's realizing you cannot really stop it, so she surrenders, and the next thing is that vortex that I was talking about. There's some relationship to the breaking of the amniotic sac and the water leaving the uterus. You can almost imagine this like a sink, and then you pull the plug and then the water is coming out and the whole thing is closing in. So this is like a maelstrom, and what we see here is a mandala made of skulls and rib cages, indicating that now she's going into an encounter with death. It's something to do with death. as we are being born, our life is threatened to different degrees. She also suddenly doesn't have any clothes. A lot of people who experience confrontation with birth and death have the feeling that it's not appropriate to do it with clothes on. And some people just have that feeling, and other people take the clothes off. When it was happening at Esalen, you know, when there is integrated bathing, and after the session, you know, all ended up in the bath. It was not a big deal. It's not great when it happens when we are doing the session somewhere at the hotel, because that's what people are going to be talking about. Somebody took off their clothes. So it's not good for what we call PR, or public relations. Okay, another interesting picture. Here she is in the underworld, in the world of the dead, and she's experiencing ordeals, pain. Remember when I talked about the shamans who had this visionary journey into the underworld and experienced ordeals. So this is a very shamanic journey that you're seeing here. I worked with her, and she didn't know anything about shamanism. She didn't know anything about Jungian psychology. All this just came out of her psyche. And here she is in the underworld. And the name of this woman? Francis Sharana.
Harriet.
She's Sharana Francis, Harriet Sharana Francis. She's Harriet Francis, and she gave herself the name Sharana, also the middle name. And the book is called Drawing It Out. You can get it from Amazon Books. She then continued with a Jungian analyst, more very fascinating experiences that took her to the Minoan culture, to kind of past life experiences in the Minoan culture, bulls and so on. So here, this is an experience of kind of abysmal loneliness. And on the biological level, this is the situation where the contractions of the uterus cut off the blood supply, which is the meaningful connection with the mother. So she was cut off from the life source. And people in this situation sometimes also feel completely cut off from the divine, and some of them quote Jesus saying, Father, why have thou forsaken me? If you even sort of, you know, cut off from the divine source in a very, very fundamental way. Another very, very interesting picture. I talked about the pressures which are involved in birth. So she lies here under a boulder, is kind of crushed by the boulder, and when she looks up, it had initially the face of her husband, and she thought it was like a metaphor for the fact that she lived in an oppressive marriage. And then it was becoming more and more her mother, and she felt it was a representation of the fact that also her mother was oppressive in her childhood. And then it just went all the way to birth, and she realized there was a situation where the mother was actually crushing her, which was as she was passing through the birth canal. And you can almost feel here, the experiences frequently come in layers, you can almost feel here at an archetypal level where this could be Sisyphus, you see, in the pits of the Hades, kind of rolling this heavy boulder, and then he got it to the top and then lost it and had to go again. So the story of Sisyphus is an archetype underlying birth, the intermittent labor. Also some of the labors of Hercules have the same quality. And she had this amazing capacity to really capture the essence of these experiences. On the perinatal level, birth is intimately connected with death. So in the process of going into the world, being born, we also have the experience of our life being threatened. Birth and death are really intertwined there. Very different from how we think about it in everyday life. The logical left brain kind of thinking. Well, birth is something that begins that happens at the beginning of life to a little child. Death happens to old people or to sick people. There's really no connection. But in our unconscious, these two processes are absolutely intertwined. And I already mentioned that there's also sexual elements. So birth, sex, and death are a triad that is, represents a package, experiential package on the level of the third matrix, and you cannot understand one of them without bringing in the other two. And there are all kinds of interconnections. Like in a near-death experience, you can have a spiritual experience. All three of them are also gateways to transcendence. So near-death experience into spirituality. Sex and spirituality in Tantra are interconnected. Near-death experience can lead to transcendence. In Tibet, there are exercises for the monks spending some time with dying people as part of spiritual opening. In France, in the French language, there is a connection between death and sexual orgasm. The orgasm is called petit mort, small death. For some people, a sexual situation can trigger fear of death, for example, and so on. There's all kinds of interconnection. So the lower part is related to death. There are the skulls, the bones, the rib cage, and the upper one is clearly related to something like birthing. She's trying to get out of it. Another really interesting connection. Here she is now having deep encounter with both birth and death. And this is where the numinosity comes into the picture. I mentioned that Jung preferred that term to talking about spiritual experiences, mystic or religious experience. There is a numinosity. You now are connecting with death, and you have a sense that you are moving into a sacred realm. So the symbols of death, the bones, are now transformed into spiritual symbols, an altar, a cross, and also these rune-like symbols, and she's sitting there like in a meditation. Another very, very interesting connection, and this is the connection between the obstetric, the surgical part of the process, and the archetypal dimension. This is where she got a manual help away from the birth canal, but when she was reliving it, it was experienced as a kind of a demigod.